Velik's cooking had always been edible. That was the kindest thing he could say about it. But eating at the raven's nest was forcing him to admit something painful. There was more to cooking than just adding fire to meat. The stew in front of him was proof of that. He shoveled another spoonful into his mouth, savoring the soft chunks of spiced meat and perfectly tender vegetables. He didn't hear footsteps until they were almost at his table. That, more than anything, told him who it was. Not many people could sneak up on him. It wasn't that he was too focused on eating, though the stew was pretty distracting. No, it was that the man approaching was just as strong as him, maybe even stronger, and almost certainly more experienced. The chair across from him scraped back. "You know," said the grizzled hunter who sat down, "you could have made it easier to find you. I just wanted to ask a few questions." Velik didn't look up. "What made you think I wanted to answer them?" The older man chuckled. "Seems like we're in the same line of work. Cooperation never hurt anyone. Name's Torwin." Velik glanced up, saw the outstretched hand, and ignored it. Not interested. Torwin let his hand hover a moment before pulling it back with a sigh. "Look, I'm not asking for a partnership. I've already got an apprentice to babysit. Just looking for answers. Word is, you're the guy who knows the most about the wilderness beyond the frontier. What's there to know? Monsters show up. I kill them. That's it." This reeks of the mayor's meddling again. Velik suppressed a scowl. Should have insisted he fill the supply order first. Then I'd be out of here by now. I wanted to ask about the night you found your class orb. Torwin was using a skill, probing gently, probably to detect lies or intent, but Velik's mental stats were too high for it to work. He shot the man a glare. Torwin winced and dropped the attempt. At least he had the decency to look ashamed. "Sorry. I'll make you a deal," Velik said. "I answer this one question, and you leave me alone." "Deal." Torwin agreed instantly. Velik took another bite, letting the silence stretch. The next spoonful had a cube of meat so perfectly tender it nearly melted on his tongue. "I should ask the cook for the recipe. Maybe I could learn to make this stuff. There's not much to the story. A friend and I decided to explore the old dungeon in the forest. It was practically abandoned, no monsters around at the time. Supposedly cleared out decades ago by some high-level hunters who destroyed the core. And you thought there'd be treasure," Torwin said with a nostalgic smile. "When I was a kid, I dreamed of finding a legendary weapon and becoming a mithril-ranked dragon slayer." Velik nodded. "Something like that. And we did find something. A class orb. The Black Fang, right? Never heard of it. It's unique," Velik said flatly. Torwin blinked. "You're saying a unique class? From a dungeon you found as a kid?" "I don't care if you believe me," Velik said, voice sharp. "They serve good food here, don't they?" Torwin chuckled, but didn't push. "Good beer, too. So, what happened to your friend?" "I don't know. I passed out during the process. When I came to, he was gone, and there was a monster crawling toward me. I ran. Think you might have reawakened the dungeon core?" "No, we never saw it. People say they're giant stone pillars. What we found was barely the size of a handball. But the monsters started appearing that same night. Yeah, the mayor blamed me. Called me a monster, too. Why would he say that? My race changed when I got the class." Torwin froze. "Your race changed? It's not a secret. Surprised no one told you." "They didn't," Torwin said, troubled. I've never heard of an orb that changes race. Could have been cursed. Maybe that's why the original hunters left it behind." "They should have taken it for disposal," Velik replied. "Unless they missed it," Torwin mused. Velik didn't care about the why. What mattered was that it changed him. That something had triggered the monster surge. Maybe the orb. Maybe coincidence. "I was thinking of checking out the dungeon myself," Torwin said. "Second team already cleared it, but I'd like to confirm it's truly dead. What if they just forced it into hibernation?" Velik scraped the last carrot from the bowl and stood. "Waste your time if you want. Just kill any monsters you see on the way. I was hoping you'd come with." "Not interested. There could be answers there, clues about your past. I've already been. 3 times. There's nothing left." Velik pushed his chair back. "Anything else?" Torwin stood, once more extending a hand. "If you change your mind, I'm staying at this inn. We're not enemies." Velik didn't shake it. The older man walked a few steps, then paused. Without turning, he said quietly, and, "I'm sorry for what happened to you. If I'd been there." He didn't finish, just sighed and walked out. Could have gone worse, Velik thought. Given how desperate he sounded a few weeks ago, I didn't expect him to take no so easily. He left a pair of silver vitroons on the table. More than enough for the meal, but it wasn't about the cost. They'd done their job. He'd used the coins to help train stealth, and now they were just loose change. Velik walked out, following Torwin's exit, but the man was already gone. Now to find whoever told him I was here. My order had better be ready. Meanwhile, Torwin found his apprentice with little effort. Jensen might have learned how not to leave a trail, but he hadn't yet learned why it mattered. "Well," Jensen asked as Torwin emerged from the underbrush. "No good." He gave a few answers, but he's not interested in helping. "Nothing new. Just confirmed he's been back to the dungeon. Our plans haven't changed. Why not make him help? He's strong, but you could take him and earn a knife in the ribs while I sleep? No thanks. Besides, I'd rather not be that kind of hunter. He'll come around. He just needs time. Could offer money. Everyone likes money. We're here to get you some valuable experience fighting monsters you can handle, not to bribe someone who doesn't want to talk." "You mean we're not doing this for the bounty? All 100 gold full mites of it?" Torwin asked dryly. "No, Jensen. I'm here because someone needs to fix this mess." Jensen's eyes widened. 100? That's it? We came 300 miles. You have no idea how much that money means to the people here, Torwin said. Not everyone grew up with a silver spoon and a staff of servants. Jensen grimaced. "Can we just go kill some monsters now?" Torwin grinned. "Don't worry. We'll do both." As much as Velik longed to return to the deep wood, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not with so many monsters stirring. The towns had their walls and the watch to man them, sure. That was enough for the odd word pack or a few stray blurhawks. But when 30 or 40 monsters banded together into a coordinated horde, stone walls and tired sentries wouldn't hold for long. That was why Velik always kept an eye out for elites. Most monsters didn't work well together. Even those of the same species were prone to fighting for territory or scraps of meat. That infighting was one of the few natural checks on their population. It made encounters deadlier, sure, but it kept the overall numbers down. Elites changed everything. They could do what normal monsters couldn't: lead. An elite warg might rally multiple packs, combining their strength into something dangerous enough to flatten a settlement. More diverse hordes, composed of different monster types, were usually smaller, but sometimes even more lethal. A flock of night screamers could disorient defenders just long enough for larger beasts to rip them apart. Velik had seen too many elites lately, more than he liked. If even half of them had started building hordes while he'd been away, and if Torwin hadn't done as thorough a job as hoped, then things could already be spiraling. So instead of vanishing into the woods when he woke late that afternoon, Velik made a full sweep of his usual patrol. He killed whatever wandered too close to town, searching for signs of consolidation, claw marks, trampled paths, monster remains. The signs were there. Elites had been gathering forces, but someone had already scattered them. Guess the old hunter earned his coin, Velik thought. Not bad work. A lot of cleanup, but no immediate disasters. He kept moving, weaving between towns and shadowing the tree line. Once the sun dipped beneath the horizon, his pace tripled. By dawn, he'd cleared over 100 miles and slain nearly 300 monsters. Still, the thoughts lingered. The conversation with Torwin, the moment with Sildra. He hadn't spoken that much in years, not meaningfully, and it left a strange emptiness in his chest, an ache he hadn't felt since he was a boy. Sildra. He hadn't expected to see her again. Yet there she'd been, sneaking around the woods in the dead of night, hunting flowers like some storybook herbalist, risking her life for what exactly? They weren't medicinal, he recalled. No market value. No alchemical demand. Just rare, pretty things that bloomed beneath moonlight. And she worked leather. What use could she possibly have for them? Still, they would bloom again soon. Maybe in a day or two. He wondered if she'd be foolish enough to try again. And if so, would she bring someone stronger this time? They only grew far from town, 10, 12 miles at least. And the monsters were meaner now than before. She'd gotten lucky last time, minus the elite. Maybe this time, she wouldn't be so lucky. Velik sighed. I could delay my return to the deep would a little longer. Clear out the forest around Deshur. Prioritize differently. He wasn't sure who he thought he was fooling. Certainly not himself. The moon silk blossoms bloomed on schedule, painting silver trails through the forest like stardust scattered across leaves. Velik waited. 3 elites emerged from the deep wood that night. None stronger than level 30. Not strong enough. His kinetic charge skill made short work of them, especially with the sharp enchantment humming through his spear. He spotted her 2 hours before sundown. Sildra, with the same bodyguard, Gorm. I knew it, Velik thought, shadowing them as they slipped into the woods. Still too stubborn for your own good. They headed for the wildflower field. Velik followed in silence, watching from the trees. Shouldn't we check the south field first? Gorm asked. No. I cleared it last time, Sildra replied. There'll be even less now. Are you sure you need this many? You said you had enough. I'm just following instructions, she said. Gorm squinted at her. Whose instructions? Good question, Velik mused. It doesn't matter, Sildra said. The old batch is useless. We need fresh ones before the full moon starts to wane. Velik narrowed his eyes. That was oddly specific. Too specific. What are you doing, Sildra? She and Gorm were loud. Easy to track. Velik cleaned up anything that got too close. Monsters that never even realized what killed them. Gorm noticed the bodies. The 3rd one tonight, he muttered. Sildra turned, her gaze brushing the trees. She smiled. Not at Velik exactly. She stared just past him, 10 feet to his right. Thank you, she said softly. Gorm blinked. What was that? Nothing. Let's keep moving. You're the boss, he said, glancing around for the 5th time in 10 minutes. That went smoother than expected, Sildra said brightly. Yeah, too smooth, Gorm muttered. Feels like the calm before something awful. I don't think anything's coming. Because of the Black Fang? I heard he was seen in Cellaret, talking to that guild hunter. Oh, I met him, she said. Nice man. Very polite. The hunter or the Black Fang? The hunter, she said with a chuckle. The Black Fang is kind, I think, but not nice, and definitely not polite. Rude, Velik thought dryly, watching from afar. A giant ferret thrashed beneath his spear, black blood pooling as he waited for the system's kill notification. Maybe don't talk about him like that, Gorm whispered. What if he is nearby? Come on, we both know it's not a coincidence. There hasn't been a single monster all night. Morgus sent him, Sildra said with reverence. I'm not so sure, Gorm replied. And even if it's true, show some respect. Now, if we're done here, let's go back. Not yet. There's one more place. What now? More flowers. No. Crescent Hill. Gorm paled. That's 30 miles away, and we need to get there before the moon sets. For hours, maybe, Velik thought. If they push. Does it have to be tonight? Gorm asked. Sildra hesitated, then looked up. No, but I want it to be. The blossoms will be freshest. Gorm groaned and looked skyward. Gods save me from stubborn girls. Fine. Hand me that pack. We'll have to run the whole way. Velik doubted they'd make it, but just in case, he'd clear the path. Whether they succeeded or not, he had to know what Sildra was doing. And either way, he thought with a smirk, I'm not letting her die in the dark. Spear in hand, he vanished into the woods, silent as wind, deadly as shadow.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Crescent Hill was a spiritual site dedicated to Morgus, god of nature and the hunt, that had been abandoned by almost everyone a decade ago. Velik didn't necessarily think that was his fault, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence that people had stopped coming out to Crescent Hill once the monsters showed up. Only the most fanatical hunters still came out to leave offerings or prey. He hadn't really expected Sildra to be one of them, but now that he thought about it, that did explain why she'd been so insistent on risking her life gathering moon silk blossoms. It was a religious thing. That wasn't something he remembered her being interested in when they were kids, but people changed and the whole area had undergone a lot of dramatic upheavals in the last decade. Velik wasn't terribly religious himself. No god had ever come to back him up when he was in trouble, and he was too busy to do stuff like spend an entire night harvesting flowers to leave next to a random rock some people had decided was holy. Morgus was probably the god whose values most closely aligned with Velik's, but he didn't spend a lot of time musing about his spiritual relationship with an absentee deity. If Morgus wanted something, Velik was sure he'd hear about it. Until then, he didn't worry about it. The shrine itself was a simple stone arch placed at the top of a hill, naturally formed in some way that wasn't immediately apparent to Velik. It was a rough, 3-foot-thick hoop of stone that rose 10 feet into the air. 5 men could walk through it at the same time without trouble. Moss grew across its surface and hung down from the top of the arch, pale green and fuzzy in the moonlight. It was an unusual enough sight that he could understand why some people might think it was divinely inspired, but Velik had seen plenty of equally strange things out in the wildlands beyond the frontier. This one didn't particularly speak to him, but I guess Sildra sees it differently. She approached the arch with Gorm trailing behind her by a few feet and began placing the moon silk blossoms on the ground around the twin bases. Velik watched with a frown from the bough of a pine tree growing at the base of the hill, unnoticed by either of the other people there. At first, it seemed like she was just spreading handfuls carelessly, but with each one she tossed out, the pattern became clearer. Somehow, seemingly by sheer coincidence, the petals were drifting down to form a mirror of the arch, a flowery shadow cast by the light of the moon. Soon, the baskets and bags of moon silk blossoms were empty, and Sildra stood atop a crescent hill adorned in luminous white flowers. That was when Velik got his first sign that a god was watching, and more, that he approved. The reflected moonlight off the scattered petals grew so bright that the entire hill lit up like it was the middle of the day. Hundreds or thousands of strands of moonlight rose up, obscuring the top of the hill and forcing Gorm back. He scrambled out of the way, slipped on something, and tumbled down the hill to collapse in a heap at the base. Velik watched anxiously, wondering the whole time if he needed to jump in and pull Sildra out of whatever was happening. After 30 seconds, the light dimmed to reveal his childhood friend standing whole and unharmed beneath the arch. Small arcs of moonlight were dancing across her skin, leaving a trail of white dots that slowly faded. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes. "It's done." "What's done?" Gorm asked, sitting upright and scowling at her while he prodded a tender lump that had appeared on his head. "The offering to Morgus, of course. He has accepted it and given me his blessing." That's fantastic. What does his blessing mean?" "It means I'm no longer a seamstress," she said. Velik's breath caught. A divinely granted class change? Gorm must have been thinking the same thing, because he scrambled to his feet. Velik couldn't see the look on his face, but it was easy to imagine. "He gave you a unique class." Sildra laughed. "No, nothing like that. I'm simply a druid now. It's what I asked for, and Morgus saw fit to grant my prayer." Velik had only a vague idea what the class did, beyond that it was some sort of nature priest. He supposed it fit well with a god known for his mastery over the wildlands, but as far as any sort of specific class abilities, he couldn't even begin to guess. "So what? You could talk to trees and animals now. Someday, maybe." She trailed off with a frown, then shook her head and refocused her eyes down the hill. "I'm sorry. It's a lot to sort through. Let's head back home for now." The two left shortly after that, with Gorm trudging through the brush, shoving it aside where he could, or hacking a path when he needed to. Sildra practically floated along behind him, her hands reaching out to caress tree trunks and leaves. When Velik looked at her through the lens of Predator's visage, he saw something that wasn't a threat, but which was still dangerous. In a way, she reminded him of a pup, weak now, but growing into a powerful wolf in the near future. Whatever it was a druid did, he didn't want to be on the receiving end of it once she'd grown into the class. Gorm hadn't made it seem that powerful, but Velik was guessing he was missing a few key points. "What are you going to do now?" Gorm asked at one point when they stopped for a break. Despite the way being clear of monsters, they'd walked or run a lot of miles for one night already. Gorm had enough points and physical to hold up, but Sildra was a different story. She'd been hanging on by her fingertips before, and now that the drive to complete her class change was missing, she was quickly growing tired. Whatever Morgus wants me to do, right now, his desire is that I help cleanse the wildlands near the frontier of this monster infestation. Druids can hunt monsters? I thought you were supposed to be peaceful, Gorm said. Some druids are healers. I don't think that's what I'll be doing. Gorm made a show of looking around. Well, you're not going to be gaining any levels like this. Velik rolled his eyes and started to circle around behind the pair. There were 3 monsters sneaking up behind them, probably not too strong for Gorm to handle on his own, but Velik wasn't going to find out. No, that's fine, Sildra told her bodyguard. I need time to read about what my class can do so I can figure out what I should do with it. I suspect. You suspect what? She glanced up through the boughs of the trees. I think my path will be tied to the moon. I'm just not sure how yet. I'm sure it'll come to you, Gorm said. Ready to start walking again? Yes, I think so. We're only a few miles from Dishur. Let's try to make it back in one push. Easier said than done. If we were coming in from the north, it'd be one thing, but the brush is so much thicker from this side. There should be a trail somewhere nearby, she said, and good luck finding it. Unable to argue, Sildra simply shrugged and motioned for Gorm to lead the way. Velik finished his ambush of the 3 monsters stalking them, wiped his spear on the fur of the least bloodied corpse, and silently drifted along behind them. He was careful to keep them within the range of his senses, even if he didn't maintain visual contact at all times. Any monsters that he sensed nearby met the same unfortunate fate, that of a quick death with his spear pinning them to the ground. The pair broke free from the tree line, with bare minutes to spare before the sun came up. As soon as Dishur was in sight, Velik broke off and darted away at a much faster speed than he'd been going all night. No longer constrained, trying to keep his presence hidden. Even though he knew both of his charges suspected he'd been lurking around them, he was able to go for quick kills without the need for subterfuge. Pushing his physical stat for all he could get from it, he arrived back home in less than an hour. By that point, the sun was up and he'd lost Duskbound, but it didn't matter. The only thing he had left to do was get some rest before he returned to the deep wood in the evening. He puttered around his rough little cave for an hour to wind down, got his bag packed, and double-checked everything, then lay down and closed his eyes. He tried to sleep, but it escaped him. Instead, he spent an hour wondering about Sildra and her new class, if he could expect to run into her regularly, if she was going to be a moon druid, whatever that meant. Presumably, she'd be on a similar schedule to him. He couldn't decide if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe if she didn't live in Dishur, it'd be easier to decide. He still hadn't found any answers when sleep finally caught up with him. The arrow struck the scalehound's flank, but instead of biting deep, it shattered into pieces. The monster, undeterred, continued its menacing stalk toward Jensen. Another arrow materialized, already set to his bowstring, and he took a moment to steady his breathing before he released it. This one was aimed for the scalehound's eye, but it simply turned its head and took the shot to the shoulder instead. That attack had no more effect than the first one. Gods above and below. What level is this thing? He swore. He didn't want to pull on the bracer's magic any deeper than he already was, but he just couldn't hurt the scalehound with basic arrows. Exhausting the bracer was a concern for later. Concentrating, he shaped another arrow out of pure magic, this one heavy with a sharp enchantment. At the same time, he called on his bow to imbue the shot with accuracy and resilience. His belt already gave him a strong bonus to physical, but it had an active effect to temporarily boost that even further. Finally, the ring on his left index finger added a layer of edge of winter, coating the tip of the arrow in razor-sharp ice. If it didn't finally get through this thing's scaly hide, nothing would. Perhaps sensing danger, the scalehound lurched into an ungainly, lopsided run. It closed the distance from 50 feet to 10 in less than a second. Then Jensen released the arrow. It jumped from the string to the scalehound's eye so fast that he couldn't see its path with his eyes, not even with the perceptive enchantment on his hat boosting his already impressively fortified mental. You have slain a burnished scalehound, level 24. The shaft vibrated in place, more than halfway buried in the monster's skull now. Jensen felt the tension drain out of him, and he let out a relieved sigh. The monster's momentum had carried it the rest of the way after its death, and its corpse was sprawled out at Jensen's feet. That was a close one, but you held steady and made the shot, Torwin told him. I knew you could do it. I'm glad one of us did. Do you think there are any more nearby? He asked. No, his master said with a shake of his head. I took care of the rest. What rest? Jensen looked around wildly, his eyes flicking from corpse to corpse. Most of them were half hidden beneath the brush or behind trees, and he knew there were a few he couldn't see. But he counted 9 more scalehounds, each one dead from a single arrow somewhere in its body. How's he do it? His bow would break from the force needed to throw an arrow that fast, and I know he's just buying the ammunition from local Fletchers. There are no enchantments in play here. They should have shattered on impact. Jensen already knew what answer he'd get. Torwin would just laugh and cite skills, then get cagey about exactly just how many skills he had merged together to fill those 6 slots he'd unlocked. Considering the man's prolific career as a monster hunter, Jensen had no doubt the number could be classified as a lot. I meant more like, will there be more monsters of the same level nearby? Jensen said, trying to inject some eagerness in his voice. That wasn't what he'd meant at all, but he didn't want his master thinking he was weak. It wasn't that he was afraid of encountering more monsters, just that he was concerned about running out of the magic he needed to actually hurt the damn things. Oh, I'm sure they'll get stronger the farther out we go. Civilization is what keeps monster levels low. When you get out into places like this, the monsters just keep killing each other and stacking on levels. As far as I can tell, the only reason these towns even still exist is because of the Black Fang. Without his presence, those towns would have been overrun a long time ago, and there's nothing out here worth fighting to keep, so the government would just abandon the frontier. Abandoning this place might be the right decision, Jensen said. The townsfolk should head south while they still have their lives. No matter how many monsters we kill, more just keep coming, and they're getting stronger. Torwin nodded along. You're right, of course. Right now, we're doing exactly what the Black Fang has been doing for the last decade. We're stalling things, reacting to monsters as we find them instead of solving the root problem. There will always be more monsters, sure, but there shouldn't be so many, not so fast. Something is accelerating their population growth, and we need to figure out what that is and stop it. And so we're going to this old dungeon that was broken 50 years ago or whenever. Right again, Torwin said. Now, does your gear need a bit longer to recharge, or are you ready to proceed? No, I'm good for a few more fights at least. Though with the amount of magic I'm using just to put an arrow into these things, I'm going to be about worthless by the time the sun goes down. That's easily remedied. You just need to locate vulnerabilities like you did with that one you shot in the eye. That's an obvious spot on most monsters, but it's not always viable. There are some signs that'll tell you where scales or fur are thinner. And of course, it pays to study what your predecessors wrote down about the monsters they hunted. Why? I remember once. Jensen had long since grown used to taking in Torwin's lectures while they scouted or fought. He still hated it, though, as the old man's voice inevitably drew in more monsters. Once, Jensen had tried to raise that point, but his master had just laughed and started a new lecture on the topic of working his way out of a disadvantageous position, such as an ambush. Overhead, the sun slowly sank toward the treetops in the western sky. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As interesting as it was to see what the area's new druid would do, Velik had already spent too much time on Sildra already. He had his own leads to chase down, which meant gathering a few thousand more Dekarmos and purchasing something that would let him get a red on mana levels. It was an awfully expensive tool just to test a theory, but Velik didn't have a better idea. If he was right about monsters showing up where mana was the thickest, then hopefully he could find those spots, figure out why mana was thicker there, and fix it. Unfortunately, he didn't have the funds to afford any sort of mana sensing gear that could be useful at the moment, not unless he could find a way to measure mana over miles and miles of wild forest using nothing but his sense of touch. It seemed easier to just save up for something that would better suit his purposes. A month ago, he would have thought differently, but discovering how much quicker Dekarmos stacked up when he was fighting monsters 5 or more levels above his own had changed his sense of scale. It had taken years to save up the 50,000 Dekarmos for his spear, But at the rate he was going now, he was confident he could buy another one in 4 months or less. Not to say that the spear wasn't worth it. Shape-shifting alone is an excellent enchantment. Having bleeding, sharp, and mending on as well is almost too good. If only it didn't have this stupid name, Bloodseeker. Did the system come up with that, or? Regardless of how it had been named, it was an excellent weapon that Velik fully expected to use for the rest of his life. It could assume any shape he needed, repaired itself when damaged, and was optimized to stab holes into monsters and make them bleed profusely, no matter how shallow the wound was. It was practically the perfect weapon. His cowl, by comparison, was relatively weak. That he'd purchased from a merchant on a caravan a year before, mostly by trading a lot of furs and other rare natural treasures he'd picked up in the forest. It had night vision on it, which was worthless to him, but it also contained perceptive, which increased his mental stats impact on his senses, and resilient, which helped him deal with things like night screamers and nosy guild hunters trying to use skills on him. The boots he'd bought from the system store as well, mostly because he kept wearing through his and wanted footwear enchanted with mending. But they also had Silent and Strider to help him walk long distances quickly and quietly was just a nice bonus. He could only hope that when he did finally pick up a piece of gear that let him sense mana, it would also have a few other useful abilities. Maybe something that give a large boost to Mystic would be useful once I free up the skill slot that Stealth is in. Some of those skills looked downright useful, but not enough to start investing free points into Mystic. If I could make up the difference in the low stat with gear, though it might be worth it. Velik hadn't given a lot of thought before, mostly because he'd expected it would be many years before he had enough Dekarmos saved up again, and even now, he had to restock his used potions before he truly started looking at new pieces of gear. But the decision suddenly seemed a lot closer than it had a month ago, and he idly perused the system store while he ran north, just to get an idea of what was available and how much it would cost him. I wonder, though, if level 30 to 35 monsters are dropping Dekarmos this fast. What about level 40 or 50? Oh, the things I could do with that kind of money. So lost in thought was he, dreaming of belts, rings, amulets, bracers, gloves, and the like, that he almost didn't realize there was someone nearby until he was only a few hundred feet away from them. Startled out of his daydreaming, he came to a halt and crouched down, only to scowl in annoyance when he recognized the voices. Those two again. Velik very nearly turned back on the spot when he heard Torwin's voice drifting through the trees ahead of him. He didn't want to be anywhere near the old hunter, not in the least because of the man's obviously high level. Predator's visage was unwavering in its conviction that Torwin would crush him if it came to a fight. It wasn't even that Velik thought the old monster hunter was going to attack him, not after that conversation they'd had. It had been a different story when he was getting chased through the woods, but now he just didn't want to answer any more prying questions about his personal life. There was also the fact that the apprentice had almost shot him purely due to bad aim, which Velik wasn't quite up to forgiving him for just yet. So, he kept his distance, even going so far as to travel a mile off to the side, just to make sure they didn't cross paths. Despite that, every few minutes Velik would catch a bit of conversation, just enough to let him know he was still moving more or less in parallel with the two hunters. Damn it, they're going to the old dungeon too. Velik's plan had been to start in that area, hunting monsters until he could pick up his new piece of gear, then working his way out looking for pockets of dense mana. There were no other landmarks out in the deep wood, not that he knew of anyway, so it didn't make much sense for Torwin to be heading anywhere else. If Velik wanted to go there, he either needed to speed up or he needed to wait a few days and go in after the others left. There was another reason to turn back, though. If the professionals were out here, that meant nobody was patrolling around towns. For the moment, the monsters weren't yet strong enough to pose a real threat to the watch, but all it would take was one elite coming by and forming a small horde. Without him or Torwin there to prevent that, he might return a few weeks, only to find there was nothing left to protect. At the same time, he'd been trying to wait out the storm for months, and it was only growing worse. If he turned back now, he could maybe push back the monsters until winter. After that, it was anybody's guess. Perhaps the monster hunter's fee would be money well spent, and they'd take care of the problem. If we're both working on it independently, that's a better chance for one of us to figure out what the problem is and eliminate it. The towns will survive. He wasn't sure he really believed that, but he didn't trust that Torwin could find a solution. After all, Velik had been looking for one for years without a single lead until he'd stumbled across that champion elite. Torwin was just going to look at some empty ruins and a big hole in the ground, deciding that he didn't really need to start out at the dungeon, especially when he still had a few days of hunting monsters in the deep wood ahead of him. Velik shifted to a more northeast course for an hour to put another 10 miles or so between himself and the other hunters, then corrected straight north. Now he'd be a good 30 miles or more from the dungeon by the time he stopped. That didn't mean the monsters stopped showing up, of course. Even without going out of his way, he still found a swarm of wasps, each the size of his fist and level 18 or 19. A stoat that had grown to be 6 feet long and covered with metallic fur. A pack of ebonfur wurgs, all level 25 or better, and a single hookfin sky swimmer, level 31. That was a fight, with the floating fish darting through the air and harrying him in a running battle that lasted almost half an hour. It weighed half a ton and had a mouth big enough to swallow him whole, but was agile enough to slip through trees without so much as rustling the leaves. That, combined with its natural magic that let it spit out jets of pressurized water, made it a tough opponent, one that didn't die until Velik managed to shape the tip of his spear into a giant fishhook after jabbing it into the monster's mouth, then hauled it down to the ground to crush its skull with repeated stomps. Ugh, it's a good thing these boots repair themselves, he thought with a grimace as he pulled his foot free of the monster's skull. Brain matter and black ichor coated the leather, but it would dry and fall off as the boots worked their magic. He ignored the mess, confirmed the kill notification, and kept on walking. Even moving at top speed, it wasn't a one-day trip back to the deep wood. Though he bypassed most of the monsters unless they were directly in his way, Velik couldn't get there in under 3, and even his stamina was nearing its limits from the hard run. He hadn't stopped to sleep, not wanting to take the time to find safe holes to rest in. When he finally got to an area where most of the monsters seemed to be in the mid to high 30s, it was around noon. Velik spent an hour locating a den, baited out the monster nesting in it, and killed it 100 feet away. Then he cleaned out the mess left inside, mostly old, gnawed upon bones and waste better left unidentified, dragged some shrubbery he ripped straight out the ground in front of the entrance, and closed his eyes to sleep. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. You have slain a burrow skidder, level 36. Velik checked his dekarma total. 7,000. Getting closer. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. You have slain a noxious stag, level 34. You have slain a bileheart doe, level 33. 9,000. Almost there. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. You have slain a black-tongued giant salamander, level 38. Spear Warden has advanced to rank 6. Oh, perfect. I was wondering if that was going to show up soon. And 9,500. Not quite there. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 5 days after he arrived in the area, Velik finally crossed the threshold he was aiming for. With 10,000 dekarmas, he could purchase an item the system store described as a mana compass, which he'd found when he'd switched tactics from gear to utility items. He was actually a bit chagrined that it had taken him so long to think of that. But as soon as he'd found exactly what he needed, and at a far more reasonable price. With a bit of melancholy, he watched as his hard-earned wealth vanished. A moment later, an ornate compass appeared in front of him. It floated in place for a second until he plucked it out of the air to examine the strange device. Normal compasses weren't something Velik really needed. It was easy enough to navigate by the sun or the stars, and besides, compasses were an expense he didn't need. So, he wasn't sure exactly what they were supposed to look like, but he was guessing it was nothing like the thing in his hand. It was round, about 2 inches across and a 1/4 inch thick. That part seemed normal enough, but from there, things started to get weird. It was made out of brass, he thought, but with little squiggly lines carved in a circle on its backside and filled with some sort of glittering white stone. In the center of the circle was a wide, flat ruby that seemed to glow with its own light. Its face was even more strange. It reminded him of a clock he'd seen in the mayor of Dishur's house as a child, with numbers inscribed in a circle that long black arrows pointed at as they spun in slow circles over and over again. He'd stared at it for hours when he'd first gotten back after the incident while the adults kept him waiting so they could argue about what to do. The mana compass looked like that, except Velik didn't recognize any of the 6 symbols arranged around the center arrow, which itself was more of a flat, red triangle. The whole thing was under glass, and little red and blue sparks chased each other around the symbols as the arrow flickered back and forth while he examined it. I have no idea how to use this. Okay, that's fine. I'll just have to figure it out. This thing probably does a bunch of stuff that's more advanced than what I need. If I point at where I know the monsters are stronger and assume that means more mana, I can tell which symbol means mana ahead. Then I just follow the arrow and we're set. It wasn't that easy, but Velik wasn't about to give up so soon after spending such an exorbitant amount of Dekarmos on the mana compass. He messed around with it for the rest of the day, trying to see if he could correlate any of the symbols with monsters or mana or the cardinal directions. Eventually, he was forced to concede defeat. The compass's system descriptions were useless, a device designed to detect and measure the density and distance of various types of mana, and whatever the little symbols meant, he couldn't figure them out. The compass was functionally useless to him unless he could find someone to show him how it worked. He could think of one person who might know, but asking for help irked Velik. It could be a moot point anyway, since the hunter duo was probably already long gone from the dungeon. With no other options besides going back to the towns, Velik set out in that direction anyway. He wasn't sure if he hoped Torwin would still be there or not, but he wasn't one to shy away from doing what needed to be done just because it was unpleasant. 2 days later, he reached the ruins of the old dungeon, as empty and foreboding as they'd always been. 10 years ago, my feet hurt. Can we take a break? We're almost there. Come on, another 5 minutes. Velik scowled at Chalin. You've said that 4 times now. They've been exploring the forest regularly all summer, oftentimes going on overnight camping trips, so they could push deeper. At first, it had just been to see what was out there, and because they didn't have a lot of responsibilities at home yet. Their parents had encouraged them, hoping it would lead to an uncommon or even rare hunter-type class when they got older. Then Chalin had come up with what had seemed like a good idea at first, but which Velik was rapidly becoming less and less enthused about. Chalin had revealed his master plan last night, to go see the ruins of the old dungeon for themselves. The reality of that had turned out to be just endless walking with no idea how far they had to go or even if they were going in the right direction. Just as Velik was about to open his mouth to demand a break this time, no more excuses, Chalin let out an excited yell and surged through the brush. A branch snapped back behind him, almost striking Velik across the face and causing him to let out an annoyed huff. That was forgotten a moment later when he saw what had gotten his friends so excited. There it is, Chalin said, practically dancing in place as he gestured wildly ahead. A whole town was sitting ahead of them, but one made of stone instead of wood. A slope ran down 100 feet to the edge of the first moss-stained building, one of a dozen that they could see from their vantage point. Exhaustion forgotten, Velik jumped ahead and started running down the hill. Hey! Chalin yelped as he scrambled to catch up. Don't go in without me. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The upper ruins looked just like Velik remembered, except with another decade's worth of moss coating them. That didn't really make much of a difference, considering they'd had 50 years of growth before he'd seen them as a child. Somehow, no trees or bushes grew between those houses, though the old cobblestone streets had long since been lost under a layer of dirt. The streets had been cleaner in the middle of the ruins when he'd been young, but time continued to bury the place. He imagined that one day the buildings would fall down or the dirt would pile up so high that the whole thing would be just another large hill covered in trees. Today was not that day, however, so Velik started down the hill to begin his search for Torwin. He'd been hoping to avoid the conversation, but bringing the mana compass to the dungeon hadn't done anything except change which direction the arrow pointed, away from the dungeon, for whatever that was worth. The dungeon was a lot bigger than the buildings on the surface. Velik actually wasn't entirely clear on why they were considered part of the whole thing, but everyone agreed that they were. Apparently, they'd been alive back before the core was broken. Monsters had spawned in the buildings, woven out of dungeon magic and ready to tear would-be hunters apart. Maybe that's all it takes. But then, isn't the whole forest basically one big dungeon if the only criteria is makes monsters? Whatever the reason, the dungeon was weirdly empty. It was supposed to be dead, but not even animals made their homes in the ruins. Velik walked through it, heading for the well in the middle of town, and peered at the moss. It was whole, completely untouched by human hands. He paused to peer briefly at the open doorway of the nearest building, as empty of anything except for dust as it had always been. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Velik scraped off a chunk of moss from the wall next to the door. "This one's empty, too," he yelled out. Chalin was in one of the other houses, looking for any sort of treasure they could take home with them. They probably wouldn't find anything, but it was still fun to search. He walked around the building toward the next one, only to fall back with a frightened screech when something leaped out at him. "Blahogara!" Chalin bellowed, arms raised over his head as he loomed over Velik. "Don't do that!" Velik scolded, his breath coming heavy. "What if I'd stabbed you?" "Nah, I'd just dodge out of the way," Chalin said. He laughed and gestured behind him. "Those three are all empty, too. This place is lame. I thought there'd be something here, but there probably was, but other people already cleaned the place out," Velik said. "Probably." Chalin nodded along. "That's why we need to go somewhere adults couldn't fit, so we can find the treasures they missed." "Like where?" Velik asked. As far as he could tell, they'd explored the whole dungeon between the two of them. "Like there." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was a little stone well, 3 feet high and 2 feet across. It had a little roof with a metal chain hanging down from it that might have connected to a bucket once upon a time. Or maybe not. It's not like this was ever a real village. Maybe it's always been a rusted chain leading down to a dry well since the day the dungeon formed. The caves at the bottom of the well were the true dungeon. They weren't really that big, but it was too dark to see unaided. That wasn't an issue for Velik anymore, and he slipped over the lip to drop 30 feet to the stone. Other than the soft scrape of his boots touching down, everything was silent. His eyes traveled the length of the cave, noting the spot where he'd once piled up wood to make a fire, so he could explore, now as bare and empty as everywhere else. There were 3 exits, all of them leading to long, looping tunnels that wrapped around each other. Occasional intersections made the whole thing confusing to navigate, so much so that he'd wasted hours walking in circles back when he was younger. Eventually, they'd found the bottom, and Velik easily navigated his way back there now. He'd last seen the door 3 years ago. It hadn't changed one bit, except that it was propped open by a chunk of stone that hadn't been there before. That a good sign for Torwin and his apprentice still being here. The door itself was tall and narrow, or at least it seemed that way. In truth, it was just as wide as any average door, but being over 10 feet tall made it appear stretched and distorted. It had no designs or handle, just a smooth indent with a lip about halfway up for him to curl his fingers around and pull. Otherwise, it was a featureless white slab of stone with hidden hinges to complete the illusion. Velik cursed the day they discovered this door. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It took the both of them working together, with Velik standing on his toes to get a grip on the indent and Chalin with his arms around Velik's waist pulling him backward, but they got the door open. It swung open silently, ponderously, like it was reluctant to reveal whatever secrets were hiding beyond it. The boys weren't going to be denied by a rock that just happened to be extraordinarily tall, however. They'd already wedged their makeshift torches upright in a small cluster of nearby rocks. But both of them scrambled to claim the lights as soon as the door swung open. "What happened here?" Velik asked in a hushed whisper as he surveyed the hall. At 50 feet long, maybe more and half as wide, it was the biggest single room he'd ever seen. A series of pillars ran down the length of the hall on either side, each one thick enough that he couldn't have gotten his arms around them if he'd tried. It was also completely wrecked. Half the pillars had been knocked down and now resembled nothing so much as a line of crooked, jagged teeth. The ones that were still upright had chunks missing from them and a spiderweb of cracks covering their surface. He was sure that a single good shove was all it would take to tip them over. "Guardian chamber," Chalin said with a grin. There must have been an epic battle in here. That means the core is nearby. Was nearby. It's dead now. Right. It should still be here, right? They're too big to haul away. Velik shrugged. I guess. That's what Dad said when I asked him. They held the torches up, really just sticks that were burning faster than Velik liked. But they had a whole bundle of them and plenty of time to get back up to the bonfire they'd built at the exit, so it was fine. Even if they somehow lost their light, they could get back by touch now that they'd explored the tunnels. The far end of the room had another doorway, similar to the one they just opened, except it was 2 doors set into one frame this time. A line of symbols had been carved across their surface, smoothly transitioning from one door to the other at the seam. Magic letters, Chalin said. This has to be the place. How do you know they're magic? How do you know they're not? They pried the doors open and walked into the core room. Just like they'd expected, it was an inert pillar with a huge slice missing from it. The story said that a living dungeon core was a brilliant, glowing gem the size of a tree, filled to the brim with magic. But once they were destroyed, they turned to rock. This is a lot less exciting than I was expecting, Velik said. Yeah. Chalin sighed and peered around. What a letdown. But, hey, what's that over there? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Velik heard soft snoring in the core room and spotted the tripwire strung across the floor halfway through, just a simple, hair-thin cord wrapped around 2 pillars with a tiny bell hanging from it off to the side. He stepped over the tripwire with a slight smile. Not that it mattered. Even with the silent enchantment on his boots and his stealth skill, somebody heard him coming. Was wondering if I'd see you here, Torwin said as he stepped through the door. Thought maybe not after you ran off the other way in the forest last week, but I guess I was wrong. Velik halted 20 feet away from the old monster hunter. Torwin was holding his bow in his hand and had a quiver of arrows at his hip, but he wasn't making any threatening moves with them yet. That hardly reassured Velik, however, as there was no doubt in his mind that the old man could have half a dozen arrows in the air in less than a second. I had something to do, he said, but I ran into a problem. You were the only one I could think of who might be able to help. I'm a bit busy with my own work right now. This won't take long, Velik said. I just need to ask a question. We could do it in less time than it takes to finish a meal. Torwin chuckled. I suppose that's fair, considering how I ambushed you during yours. All right, what do you want to know? The mana compass was sitting in Velik's pocket where he could easily access it. He'd been taking it out and studying it as he traveled, trying to figure out what correlation there was between the direction the arrow pointed and that particular stretch of the deep wood. Fishing it out now, he held it up for Torwin to see. Can you explain how to use this? A mana compass? Torwin asked in surprise. What do you have that for? To look for mana. Obviously. Why do you need to find mana? To see if the monsters are coming from where the mana is. Velik had no idea if it would work, but he didn't have a better idea, and he needed to try something new. Besides, he'd already wasted all his Dekarmos on the compass, not having realized it had a bunch of customizations and no instruction manual. Is there a reason you think there's some connection between pockets of mana and monsters appearing? Torwin asked slowly, a thoughtful frown on his face as he absently scratched at his beard. I think champion elites can only claim an arena where there is enough mana for them to grow from their seeds. If that's true for champions, why can't it be true for weaker monsters? What? No, that's not true at all, Torwin said. Champion elites are created by dungeons to guard specific areas. The dungeon itself feeds the seed the mana it needs to grow into a monster. Truthfully, that's how it makes all of its monsters. That's why everyone's first guess about the rising monster population was that this old place was active again. But it isn't, is it? Velik asked. Nothing looked different from the last time he'd been here, but he hadn't gotten a look at the core yet. No, it's definitely dead. There are no monsters coming out of this dungeon. I don't think you're going to find any random mana pockets out in the forest that are spawning monsters, either. But, this dungeon might be dead. That doesn't mean there isn't another one somewhere else. Velik looked down at the compass in his hand. Dungeons produce mana, so this could lead me to it if there's one. In theory, Torwin said, it depends on the range of the compass. There are 1,000,000 acres of untamed forest to comb through, so it could still be years of searching. Can I see it? Velik tossed the compass over, and Torwin caught it easily. He let out a low whistle as soon as he looked at it and shook his head. Spent a good chunk of Dekarmos on this thing. Huh? I don't even know what half these runes mean. He flipped it over and looked at the ruby set into the back. Did you even attune yourself to this thing yet? Attune myself? Like I did with my spear? Velik hadn't realized he'd need to. He'd been thinking of it more like a potion, just a tool that he used when he needed it. Exactly. Right now, it's just pointing at whatever the closest source of mana it can detect that's within the default threshold and parameters. You'll need to attune yourself in order to change those. What do the symbols you understand mean? Torwin shrugged. I know this top slot is for environmental or living mana, maybe a few other things. I used one once when I was hunting down a wyvern out by Mestia, but someone else configured the compass for me so that it would exclude anything under a monster of a certain level of strength. Took 3 tries, but my team got the wyvern in the end. What about the rest? Velik asked. More filters for what kind of mana you're looking for. I think this one is for how chaotic the mana is here on the left side, and the opposite one measures an elemental affinity. I'm not sure about the rest. With another shrug, Torwin tossed the compass back to Velik. He studied it for a moment, committing the symbols, runes he called them, to memory. Now that he knew he needed to attune to the compass like any other piece of gear. Should have thought to do that myself. I can't believe I wasted days walking out here for a 30-second conversation about this thing. Something must have been showing on his face, because Torwin said, if it makes you feel any better when you're done with that thing, you can probably sell it at the second-hand market in Cravel. Depending on how good you are at haggling, you can get at least half what you paid for it back. I've never been to Cravel, Velik said. 300 miles south of Allensburth. Just stick to the road and follow the signs at intersections. The speed you move at, I'm sure you could be there in under a week. If it was open road, Velik was guessing more like 2 days, especially if he started the journey at sundown and didn't stop for sleep. Of course, once he got there, he'd be completely out of his element, having never set foot in a town with a population bigger than 500. Thanks. I'll consider it, he said. Mind if I ask you a question, too? Torwin said suddenly. I don't promise an answer. The old hunter barked out a laugh, loud enough that someone stirred in the core room. They both glanced back through the open door, and he said, My apprentice. Jensen, Velik said. Yes. You know him? Torwin blinked in surprise. No. Heard you say his name a few weeks ago. When did you? Never mind. I was hoping you could show me where you found the class orb when you were a kid. Sure, it's back behind you. In the core room? No, behind one of the walls. The walls. Torwin glanced back over his shoulder through the open door. How in the... There are plenty of cracks. We were 7. It wasn't hard to squeeze through one. Okay, but why is there another room behind this one? I never thought to ask, Velik confessed. Hidden treasure room. Maybe, but the team that cleared it should have found it. And if they didn't, there would have been more than just a single class orb in there. Torwin muttered to himself. He shot a look at Velik, then added, if it even was a class orb. If that's all, I have my own work to get back to, Velik said. Thank you for the help. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to walk with you for a bit. I want to discuss coordinating our work to resolve this whole monster problem. Coordinating? Velik repeated. What? Look, we're obviously both trying to do the same thing here. Sharing some information can't hurt, right? You probably know a lot about the area that I'm still getting caught up on. I bet I know a few tricks you haven't thought up yourself yet. We can help each other out here. I don't like working with other people, Velik said flatly. Torwin nodded along. And I get that. I'm not asking you to follow me around and take orders. I just like to avoid duplicating effort. The faster we get this infestation cleared out, the better it is for everyone. It made sense, but Velik was hesitant to trust someone so strong. Even this conversation was a risk, though less of one with the moon in the sky. If Torwin did attack him, he was confident he could escape and outrun the older hunter. He'd made sure to keep some distance between them and his back lined up with the exit. There were enough intact pillars to give him some cover if it came down to it. I don't think there's anything more to talk about. I'm going to hunt for sources of strong mana. If this ends the problem, you'll know for yourself soon enough. If not, then I'll think of something else to try. Yeah, I thought that'd be your answer. Kid, you've lived a hard life and relied on nothing but yourself. I respect that. And you're strong, so I'd say you've done all right. But you need to learn to accept help and how to trust other people. Thank you for the advice, Velik said as politely as he could manage. Then he turned and started walking away. Thankfully, Torwin just let a heavy sigh escape his lips before walking back into the core chamber. A few minutes later, Velik ran between two buildings and out into the trees, leaving the dungeon far behind. The whole time, he looked over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being pursued, and he spent the rest of the night using every trick he knew to obscure his trail to keep from being followed. Now I just hope that he doesn't have his own mana compass that will point him in the same direction as mine. No way to avoid that, though, not and still learn what I needed to. Hopefully, the gamble had paid off. Torwin scratched at his beard as he paced back and forth. That kid needs some serious therapy. I mean, I don't blame him. What that town did to him was atrocious. It's no wonder he doesn't trust anyone and spooks like a startled rabbit every time he sees me. You all right? Jensen asked. His apprentice was sitting up on his bedroll, a blanket still draped across his legs and bunched up around his waist. His bow was propped up against the wall, and his armor sat in a pile next to him. Admittedly, it would only take a few seconds to slip it on, but a few seconds was the difference between life and death in an ambush. I can't believe you slept through someone walking within 20 feet of you, and then you missed half the conversation. I knew you were talking to someone, Jensen said hotly. I figured if you needed me, you'd say so. More like you were too lazy to get out of bed, Torwin thought sourly. And you were doing so well this last week. Maybe not. Ranger good, but still better. The Black Fang paid us a visit, he told his apprentice. That guy? I didn't miss much then. The jealousy was obvious, and that was at least partly Torwin's fault. He let slip how impressive he'd found the boys' performance against that wind-shaping elite, and Jensen had taken that personally. A little rivalry could inspire students to reach for greater heights, but in this case, the difference in skill was too great. Jensen just wasn't at the Black Fang's level, unique class, and actual level notwithstanding. Without his daddy's money, he's not even on the level of other hunters who are actually at his level. He had a mana compass and an idea about tracking areas of high mana density to look for the cause of the monster infestation. Jensen yawned and stretched, then clambered to his feet. You think that'd work? He asked as he slipped his enchanted leather tunic over his head. I don't know. Depends on how well he can use the compass. Even if he finds high-density areas, that doesn't mean the monsters are spawning there. Might be worth looking into anyway. It's not like we found anything useful here. While Jensen was getting dressed and stowing everything away in his pack, Torwin did a lap around the room and peered through every crack more than a few inches wide. The east and west walls showed nothing but dirt, and the north wall was in good enough condition that it didn't really have any cracks at all. I should have had him pointed out before he left. How annoying. Where did you go when you were a child? There's nothing here. What are you doing? Jensen asked. The Black Fang told me he crawled through a crack in this room as a child, that he and his friend found a class orb that gave him his class on the other side. None of these cracks have anything behind them, though. Maybe the room collapsed later. Maybe, Torwin said, but he wasn't convinced. What am I missing? He crouched down, trying to get himself at eye level with a child. This is the angle you saw the world from. What did you see that I don't? But there was nothing, just four walls, the door, and the broken dungeon core. The pillar was dark and lifeless, unmarred but for the huge slice taken out of it 5 feet up from the floor. It was easy enough to see what had happened, too. Someone with a ridiculously strong class had struck the core with a horizontal swipe of some heavy weapon, probably an axe or pick, and sliced a chunk 2 feet wide out of the stone. It had fractured into 1,000 pieces and left pock marks all over the far wall. Dungeon cores were actually remarkably fragile, barely stronger than regular stone, without mana to reinforce them. Teams usually exhausted the core by killing every monster it could produce, then destroyed it in a single blow, exactly like what had happened here. Still crouching, he scooted forward a few steps. Nothing. He scanned the room again, but the new angle didn't help. There was nothing to see, nothing except the core, he said. What about it? Jensen asked, torn between confusion and laughter at Torwin's antics. Huh, I was right. Torwin leaned down and looked at the damaged spot, specifically at the top of it. Anyone over 5 feet tall would have missed it, but to a pair of inquisitive children, it would have been the first thing they saw. Extending up through the pillar itself was a crack, a foot wide and almost twice as long. He stuck his head into the gap in the core and looked straight up. "There's a room above this one," he said. "When it broke the core, it must have split it all the way up the center. Nobody else saw it because they were too tall. Or maybe they did see it and just didn't care. But those kids saw it and they climbed up there." It looked tight, but Torwin was flexible, and if he did get stuck, his physical was high enough to break stone. "He'd be fine. Watch the door for me," he told Jensen. Not that he expected something to burst through, but he'd be vulnerable, and it was best to plan for unlikely surprises. Setting his bow aside and unstrapping his quiver, Torwin started to wriggle his way into the crack. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chalin was the first one through, with Velik right behind him. In hindsight, he should have waited a minute so that all the pebbles resting in the crack that Chalin had kicked down wouldn't have fallen on him. He'd been too impatient, even after the first one had hit him on the head, and he'd paid for it. "Sorry," Chalin said. "It's all right as long as we finally get some treasure." Getting a lit stick to the top had been the hardest part, but they'd managed to set one on fire and throw it all the way to the top without it falling back down on them. 20 feet didn't feel like a lot, but it had been a tricky shot to make. Not willing to give up, they tried dozens of times before managing to make it work. Eagerly, Velik snatched up the fitfully burning stick and held it to another one he'd carried up with him. It caught, and he handed it to Chalin so they could look around. "Well, it certainly looks impressive," the boy said. The walls were covered in intricate grooves like some sort of massive spider's web, except they curved around and swooped through each other instead of going straight. The grooves continued across the floor, all eventually leading to the center of the room where they climbed up. "What do you think it does?" Velik asked. "I don't know. Nothing now, I guess. Maybe back when the dungeon was alive, this had a purpose. Now it's just a fun design. But no treasure." "No," Chalin agreed. He peered around, holding his makeshift torch up and scanning the room. Nothing but a bunch of weird lines. "Wait, there's something." Velik hurried forward and scooped up a stone off the floor. Unlike the rest of the ruined dungeon, it was glossy and smooth, a perfect orb of glass. "Wow," Chalin said. "That looks expensive. Still think this trip was a waste of time. How much do you think it's worth?" Velik asked as he peered at it. Light reflected from the torch in his other hand, seeming almost to dance inside the orb like it was alive. "A lot. Here, let me see." Chalin went to claim the orb to investigate, but the instant it touched his hands, it formed a bridge between the two boys. At that same moment, light flared inside it, no mere reflection, and words appeared in Velik's mind. Parameters have been met. Guardian role selected. User has not reached maturation. User's racial profile will be updated to accommodate class selection. "What's happening?" Velik yelled, or at least he tried to. His body was locked into place, rigid and stiff with the orb halfway between his hand and Kalen's. No words came from his mouth as the seconds stretched on. A wave of pain rolled through Velik's body, like he was holding his hand too close to the fire, except it spread to cover his whole arm, then his chest. In an instant, no part of him didn't feel like it was burning, but he couldn't scream. Then the light winked out as suddenly as it had appeared, and everything went dark. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Torwin crouched down and picked up a glass orb, 4 inches wide, and split down the middle. One side was perhaps slightly larger, but he'd need one of those fancy merchant scales to weigh each piece to know for certain. He wasn't too worried about that particular detail, however. Holding the 2 pieces together, he turned it to look at the orb from different angles. No matter how he looked at it, he was sure of one simple truth. The problem was that it just didn't make any sense to him. Whatever this thing is, it's not a class orb. The mana compass was far too complicated, in Velik's opinion, and he didn't understand why it needed to be attuned to him in order to function. It didn't seem to do anything different from when he'd first acquired it, other than that he could now rotate the symbols by prodding them. That caused the arrow to flicker in seemingly random directions, but without knowing what the symbols actually represented for sure. it wasn't helpful. He set it to monster and started following the compass with the hope that it would lead him toward the closest monster with a high amount of mana concentrated in it. In that regard, he was disappointed to find a weak level 27 a mile away. This'll make killing them more efficient, I suppose, but it doesn't really solve my problem, he thought as he stared down at the arrow, which had shifted direction to point slightly off to the right the instant the monster had died. Maybe if I adjust this part here. A bit of experimentation over the next few hours taught him a bit about how to set the threshold, which wasn't based on a monster's level, but rather by how much mana it had in it. As far as he could tell, the more radically mutated from the base animal the monster was, the stronger its mana signature was. Presumably, those monsters that were born from pure mana would be prime targets for the compass. What he really wanted to find was another champion elite. Velik was hoping they'd lead him to Chalin. Somehow, his childhood friend had lived through that night. For all Velik knew, that monster might have been Chalin, transformed by the same thing that had turned him into a Duskbound and granted him his class. If that was the case, and Chalin was in fact the source of all monsters, then Velik had to admit he had no idea what the class orb had given his friend. As far as he knew, people couldn't make monsters. Even if they could, they certainly couldn't make hundreds of thousands of them. Velik spent the night following the compass and messing with its settings. Slowly, his Dekarma count started to build back up, at least enough for him to start looking at purchasing some replacement potions for emergencies. The compass didn't do all that much to speed things up, not when the monsters were dense enough that he could move from one to another just by following his own senses, but he was slowly getting the device tuned to lead him to bigger and stronger prey, which meant more money. Eventually, the compass led him to a peculiar stand of trees, all planted in evenly spaced rows running in parallel. Well, if the compass is right, there's a monster here right in the middle of all this. And considering how damn weird this looks, I'd say I'm about to walk into a fight with another champion. The question of why the champions had arenas out in random stretches of the deep wood was not lost on Velik, but he didn't have an answer. All he could do was follow the trail and hope it led him where he wanted to go. Unfortunately, to do that, he needed to kill the champion elite hiding in the strange grove so that the compass would point the way to the next one. He'd gained a new skill, a few ranks, and a level since he'd fought his first champion. Beyond that, he had weeks of additional experience fighting monsters that were a higher level than him, something he hadn't had to do since he was a boy just starting out. Picking a fight was a gamble, but so was everything else he did. His whole life had been a series of calculated risks, so it was hard to be scared of the latest one on the stack. His spear slithered down his arm and solidified into its combat shape, and he stepped out into an open row. Nothing happened immediately, certainly nothing as viscerally violent as a ring of fire springing up around the grove. Everything was quiet, but it was the natural silence of a forest, comfortable and filled with the chirpings of bugs and the rustle of leaves as birds flitted through them. "Where are you? Come on out. I know you're here." His eyes flicked back and forth, looking for some signs of the monster his compass had told him was lurking in the grove. Just because he couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't there, of course. He relied on his other senses to get a feel for what was going on around him in an environment so heavy with visual obstructions, and they weren't giving him anything. Velik came to a stop in the middle of the grove and turned in a circle. Tree, tree, tree. No undergrowth. Branches are all at least 10 feet off the ground. Trunks are all the same size. No bugs on them anywhere. No animals at all. Does the monster eat them? Or do they know better than to come here? That'd be, what was that? His eyes had almost slid past the gossamer line anchored between two trees at the far end of the grove. That hadn't been there before. Spider webbing? Hidden spiders? That line is too thin to be made by anything big. There's no movement, but a horde of normal spiders could hide easily. If the champion was some sort of sentient colony of spiders, this was going to be a messy fight. Velik was specialized for killing large, singular monsters, but he was tough and fast enough that a cloud of biting insects was generally more of an annoyance than a true threat. When that cloud was composed of champion elite monsters, he suspected he'd encounter a few surprises. He completed another circuit and found a new line of spider silk between two nearby trees. The monsters were boxing him in, cutting off his options, and he hadn't even spotted them yet. He needed to view the scene from a different angle, literally. So he took off in a burst, traveling 50 feet in a quarter of a second and spinning to see the backs of the trees where the spiders were lurking. Except there were no spiders. There wasn't anything at all. Are they invisible? If so, then he'd bitten off more than he could chew. This kind of champion would require some sort of mage class capable of splashing fire or acid all over the grove, something that was completely outside his capabilities. Retreat was the only viable option. Something flashed by him, and a line of burning fire drew itself across his back. Velik spun, his spear whipping around to catch his attacker, but it was gone. Only the hot blood seeping down his back proved there'd been anything at all. It hurt far more than it had a right to, so much so that Velik's mind immediately jumped to some sort of poison. That would be on theme for a spider monster. He ignored the pain and kept up a slow rotation while moving closer to the edge of the grove. As far as he could tell, there was nothing keeping him from fleeing this time, and he'd clearly run into a bad matchup for his skill set. It wasn't often he was forced to run, but he wasn't stupid enough to let a little pride keep him in a bad situation. He saw a streak of black out of the corner of his eye and turned, his spear leading to slash at it. Despite his speed, it was gone before he could bring it fully into his range of vision. Not invisible, just ridiculously fast. This time, he wasn't distracted by a fresh injury. He heard the soft crunch of something hitting bark on the tree next to him, but it was gone before he could spot it. Predator's visage was giving him nothing to work with either. Whatever this spider monster was, he needed to get out of its hunting ground. Still spinning in a slow circle to watch around him, Velik started walking toward the edge of the grove. If he didn't know any better, he'd have sworn he was alone. Just going by the size of this gash, it's got to be bigger than a regular insect. Not a swarm, then. No way 1,000 spiders that come up to my knee are hiding here. But if it's just one, where is it? Something pressed into the side of his leg, just below the top of his boot. Velik froze and looked down to see a hair-thin slice in the leather and a line of spider silk pressed up against it. It was barely even bowed out, certainly not enough to snap it. Cautiously, Velik pulled his leg back and dipped his spear down to slice through the line. It parted, but scored a line across the spearhead. How sharp is this webbing? This is insane. He glanced back up at the edge of the grove and frowned to see no less than a dozen strands running from tree to tree in his way. The monster had predicted his exit path and taken steps to block him off. He could cut through them, but not without damaging his weapon. The mending enchantment would fix that if he gave it enough time, but he might not live that long if he rendered the spear useless in the middle of a fight. Shifting directions and making sure to walk sideways so he could keep an eye on his path while watching for monsters was difficult, but Velik made it work. That was how he spotted the line of spider silk zipping through the air to settle in place, then go taut against the other tree. Something black and green darted up the trunk and into the canopy, silent as a breath of air and far faster. Found you. The spider was bigger than he was expecting. Its exact size was still obscured, but it had to be at least 2 feet long, not including the legs, which were thin and delicate. Somehow, it had enough agility to slip up and down trees and across branches without so much as shaking them. That probably meant it was extremely light in addition to being adept at distributing its weight across all of its limbs. There could be some magic involved in the process to account for its incredible speed, or that might just be raw stats. Either way, it was blocking his escape routes. The idea of trying to navigate his way through strands sharp enough to cut through leather that brushed up against it while simultaneously fending off a lightning strike in arachnid form did not appeal to him. That meant he needed to find a different way out of the grove, or he had to kill the champion. Hard to fight a monster I can't keep track of, he thought as he scoured the branches overhead for even the smallest signs of movement. It wasn't a good strategy, not against something so quick and nimble. However, the monster was doing it. Its movements were practically undetectable. Velik was usually the one doing the ambushing when he found a monster, but there'd been occasions where he'd been caught by surprise back before he'd forged Predator's visage out of its disparate skills. Most of them had been sensory skills, but they also included one called ambush tactics that helped him pick out vulnerable targets and find places to hide while he waited strike. Except I don't need that now. I'm the prey this time. Well, two can play at this game. Maybe I can't find it, but with stealth, I can make it harder for the champion to find me. A cat-and-mouse game with two cats wasn't what Velik had been planning when he'd stepped into the grove, but if that was what it took to kill the champion, he'd do it. Predator's visage had only gotten a glancing look at it, but that had been enough to confirm how dangerous it was. He could kill it if he could catch up to it. Fading back behind a tree to break line of sight from where he'd last seen the spider, he leaped up into the branches and paused to listen. There was nothing but the breeze in the trees and some bugs in the background. A bird flew over the grove, something blue with black bars across its feathers. It got halfway across before it suddenly burst into a cloud of blood and meat. The blood ran down an otherwise invisible silken line that had slashed through the bird. Territorial little bastard, aren't you? But that was a mistake. Now I know where you are. He crept out on the branch, his balance perfect to keep it from shifting as he moved. It was thick enough to hold his weight, but he could only get a few feet from the trunk before that changed. That was enough to give him an opening to leap to the next branch without touching anything, though. After shrinking his spear down to something only 2 feet long, he made the jump. Stealth flared in his mind, guiding his body to keep him quiet as he touched down and the wood absorbed his momentum. It shifted ever so slightly, just enough to rustle the leaves once. It could have been a stray breeze, but Velik was counting on the champion to know it wasn't. He knew where it was. Now he knew where it was going. All he needed to do was adjust his position to catch it on its way in. To that end, he dropped lightly to the ground and ghosted 2 trees over in the row. That was the dangerous part. He couldn't assume the spider would move in a straight line, but if it did, the trees would block its line of sight. If it angled in from the left, he'd also be fine. If it came from the right side, though, it would definitely see him. 2 in 3 chance this works. He jumped up to his new perch, his spear ready in his hands. If he was right, the spider would pass right in front of him on its way to ambush him. If not, he was about to get hit again. But he knew where his blind spots were, and there were only 2 possible angles the spider could hit him. Both of them required the spider to either circle the entire grove or to pass through other areas he could see in order to reach him. It was a faint rustling that saved his life. Whether the monster had some way to sense his position or had just known enough to eliminate the other possibilities and predict where Velik had hidden himself, or had just gotten lucky and cut across the grove at the one angle that Velik couldn't hide from, it had decided to avoid his trap altogether and had taken to the tops of the trees. The canopy hid it, but not even its skills could keep it from shifting branches with its weight. Velik looked up just in time to see it dropping down from above. For a fraction of a second, he got a good look at it. 8 thin, tapered legs with barbs and hooks at the joints, and what looked like dagger tips at the end, a segmented body of green and black covered in fine, spiky hair, and a pair of wickedly curving fangs with a horror show of a mouth between them. Its eyes were a ring around the front half of its head, all of them dull and black, the passionless eyes of a predator. Then he realized the spider wasn't falling. It had flung itself off a branch, likely what had caused it to rustle, and it was moving far, far faster than merely falling could account for. There was no time to bring his spear around, not before the monster hit him, and he did not want to be trapped between the legs of a spider that could give him a full-body hug, so he did the only thing he could do. Velik threw himself backwards off the tree branch. Other, smaller branches struck him on the way down, most of them snapping under his weight, but a few of the larger ones smacking and jostling him. At the same time, his spear grew another 2 feet, and the tip sharpened into something similar to a sword's blade. Pain shot through him as he struck the ground, back first, right where the spider had cut him before. He ignored it and readied the spear to drive it right through the monster's abdomen when it tried to land on him. It was in a free fall now. It couldn't possibly avoid being impaled. Inches away from contact, it was suddenly pulled sideways, where it did an impressively acrobatic flip in midair to land on the side of a tree. Already situated, all 8 of its legs propelled it up into the canopy and out of sight. No, you don't. Velik jumped to his feet, intent on chasing the spider down. He froze halfway there, just barely in time to avoid wrapping the slicing line of spider silk it had used to pull itself out of the way of his spear around his face. By the time he'd slipped around it, the champion was gone again. Damn it! Where'd you go, you little shit? This thing was the ultimate ambush predator, and if he was going to kill it, he needed to start thinking like it. He tried to set a trap, but it failed to think in 3 dimensions. This was a champion elite. The grove was as much a part of the battle as the spider itself. So, I'm a giant murderous spider intent on killing the intruder in my territory. I want to ambush the human, and I'm light enough to move completely silently anywhere but the very top of the trees. I also shit out silk lines strong enough to hold my weight and capable of scoring enchanted steel. He had to keep moving to avoid getting caught in the spider's net, and it knew that. It was probably predicting his moves because it knew which directions it had already cut him off in. A damn spider was outthinking him no matter what he did. As Velik slunk through the grove, pulling hard on stealth to keep him hidden, he realized that he was never going to spot the spider before it attacked. It was too good at what it did. He needed to outflank it instead of waiting for it to come to him. There was no turning its ambush back on it, not as quickly as it moved and not without the ability to actually hide. The only way to win was to do exactly what it was doing to him. What does the predator move? And how does the prey protect itself when it can't see the predator, but it knows something is there anyway? By being acutely aware of its own weaknesses, by knowing where it's most vulnerable, and ensuring that those vulnerabilities can't be exploited. The prey that survives does so by being prepared for the predator to attack long before the predator even shows up. It was something that seemed so obvious in retrospect that Velik couldn't believe he hadn't thought of it before. Too many years of playing the predator had blinded him to the opposite side of the cycle. But he knew what to do now. It was just a matter of doing it. Stealth has advanced to rank 9. Stealth has been folded into Predator's visage. Predator's visage has become Apex Hunter. Apex Hunter set to rank 1. What had been vague intuition moments ago crystallized into sharp focus. Velik was no longer blindly guessing where his prey was and how it would approach him based on incomplete information. Now he could clearly see the whole game laid out in front of him. Move and countermove, feints and strikes. Apex Hunter was the merger of his extraordinary senses, his ability to position himself in such a way as to take his victim by surprise, and most importantly, his newfound insight into how to infer the location of a predator without actually ever seeing it. With that, he had all the tools he needed to win. The cutting strands of spider silk had been a hindrance a minute ago, something that limited his options and forced him to proceed carefully lest he stumble into one and injure himself on it. Now, he found them easily because they were right where he expected them to be. Knowing where to look instead of sweeping the whole grove with his eyes and hoping to find something made the whole process far more efficient. They also laid a trail for him to follow back to the monster's current hiding spot. It could shoot them out, but one end of every strand had connected to the spider itself, at least momentarily. Together, they painted a map of the roads it took across the grove, which branches it favored to support its weight and which angles it liked to move at. The champion was 40 feet away, halfway up a tree to his left, and still as a statue. Almost its entire body was hidden in the foliage, but tracing the spider silk had revealed a clear trail, and that single sliver of green-black body was all he needed to confirm its location. The question then became how best to approach it, and that was a question he was sure he had an answer for. Knowing where the lines of spider silk were helped, but they were still in his way. Some of them had been placed deliberately as obstacles between him and the spider's current position. Throwing the spear this early in the fight was a disastrous idea. Unlike the last champion he'd fought, this one didn't have a scratch on it. Besides, he wasn't trying to fight his way through a bone-charring aura of fire, and he was pretty sure a single good blow would end things, anyway. Casually approaching, it was also out of the question. The spider was greased, lightning on 8 legs, so fast that his eyes could barely trace the blur of its movements. There was no way it would just sit there while he walked over to it, but maybe he could force it in a specific direction. The trail of spider silk it had left gave Velik the impression that it wasn't immune to its own webs, and it had been careful not to cross the lines too closely when it made more. His new skill provided the answer. He'd tried it before, but the spider had bested him last time. It was faster than him and had a custom arena to stalk its victims through. He couldn't chase it down, but he could force it to come after him simply by trying to leave the grove. It would have to stop him, and to do that, it would need to get ahead of him. Unless it wanted to circle outside its designated arena, which Velik wasn't sure a champion could actually even do, it would need to either take to the very top of the trees, or it would have to pass down a corridor it had made of its own silk. If he moved fast enough, he could take even that choice away. There was one final trump card to play, a move that he was almost sure the champion couldn't know about. If Velik was right, it would eliminate the spider's biggest advantage over him, forcing the monster into an open confrontation that it would certainly lose. His only fear was that it would instead choose to flee, turning their battle into a game of tag where he failed to match its speed and had to worry about getting sliced up by spider silk lines. His plan was made. All that remained was to execute it and see how many times he'd wrongly predicted his foe's responses. Velik started walking backward, angling off to his right as he went to cut between two trees and jump into the next row. There were still silk lines there to be wary of, but not so many that he couldn't thread his way through them. His spear half shortened while the blade lengthened until it looked something like a machete with a handle that was 5 times longer than it needed. Shape-shifting had its limits, and the weapon still needed to have a profile consistent with a spear. As soon as he slashed through the first line, the spider figured out what he was doing. It disappeared from its perch in a blur that he immediately lost track of, and he didn't bother to try finding it again. The only thing that mattered was whether it would approach from above or below. If he didn't hear the treetops rustling, he'd know for sure. Abandoning all pretense at caution, Velik spun on his heels and dashed forward. He dipped under a line that was the same height as his nose and sliced apart another 1-2 feet later that would have bit into his knee, his focus now on Apex Hunter to tell him whether he'd correctly guessed his prey's reaction. No rustle. That means it's coming right by me. Just need to time this right. Velik did something he normally never would have done while fighting for his life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the mana compass. Its arrow pointed almost directly at him, just slightly to the right, which he took to mean the spider monster itself was there. With each passing moment, the champion got closer and the arrow shifted a few degrees. As soon as it pointed straight to the right, it would be passing him by. Got you. The arrow hit the right angle and Velik spun in place, lashing out with the spear even as shape-shifting worked to increase its reach. In the blink of an eye, it tripled in length and the blade bit into something with a hard crunch. The impact almost jerked the weapon out of his grasp, forcing him to drop the compass and grab hold with his other hand. A blur of black and green flailing limbs tore past him, leaving a wildly spurting trail of dark ichor as it rolled end over end. A leg went sailing off between the trees when the spider struck one of its own silk lines, but despite the damage, the monster quickly reoriented itself. They stood on the ground, 20 feet from each other, one bleeding from the stump of a missing leg and a split open carapace, and the other from a wide gash down his back. The spider wasn't stupid. It saw the mana compass between Velik's feet, and he was pretty sure it realized exactly what it meant. With that, its hit and run tactics wouldn't be nearly as effective. If it moved from its current position, he'd be free to walk out of the grove. That meant the monster's only choices were to stand and fight or to let its prey escape. For all his newfound insight, Velik couldn't read what it was thinking. That half circle of dead, black eyes stared at him steadily, perhaps assessing its chances, perhaps seething with silent, single-minded hatred. Whether it thought it could win, or it just couldn't fathom letting prey escape without a fight, a single twitch of its mouth between those sharp, wickedly curved fangs was all the warning it gave Velik. The loss of a leg did nothing to slow its rush, and even on open ground, it was still so fast that Velik saw nothing but a blur of dark color. Acting on instinct he couldn't fully rationalize, he whipped his spear out, slashing to his left while stepping to his right. It was tough to say whether he or the spider was more surprised, but the blade of his spear clipped another of its legs and sent it into a tumbling spin as it rushed past him. There was no time to follow up on the attack before it rushed back out of range. Velik lunged after it, his spear leading the way, but he couldn't keep up with its speed, even when it was wounded. Quit running and end this already. Unsurprisingly, the champion elite didn't oblige him. It disappeared deeper into the grove, leaving Velik to retreat back to his position to reclaim his compass. The problem was that when he got back there, it was gone. Did I kick it during that last exchange? He scanned the ground nearby, hoping to find it a few feet away, but there was no sign of it. Oh, shit. Don't tell me. Looking up, he saw the compass 100 feet away from him, almost exactly in the center of the grove. The spider had snatched it up when it blew past him somehow, probably to try to eliminate his advantage, or trying to use it as bait. The thing took weeks of nonstop work to save up for. I need it. Damn spider is too smart for its own good. It turned the tables on me. Now he was the one being forced into a position of vulnerability, or he could abandon the compass and run, but the spider knew he wouldn't. Come on, then, he muttered grimly as he reshaped his spear. Let's see how much those injuries slow you down. Velik didn't rush straight for the compass. That would just be walking directly into the spider's trap, and he didn't see any good reason to make things easy for the monster. It was already moving to cut off his escape routes, but he knew as soon as he approached the middle of the grove, it would hit him from behind. Apex Hunter urged patience. The spider was wounded, perhaps fatally so. It was only a matter of time before it succumbed to the injuries he'd already dealt it. All he had to do was to protect himself until the spider pumped out the last bit of ichor through its leg stump. That was all well and good, but letting it work uninterrupted while it sealed him inside a cocoon of lethal webbing didn't strike Velik as a good idea. He needed to be proactive, and that meant pitting his perceptiveness and reaction time against the spider's stealth and speed. He approached the compass slowly, spear at the ready, and his mind already calculating the angle he was most likely to be attacked from. It would come from a blind spot, which meant behind or above him. The webs were thickest off to the left, so he expected it to attack from the right, probably with the intent of either driving him into the spider's silk or to give him some sort of debilitating injury as it rushed past him. This whole fight would have been a lot easier if I still had that haste potion. Shame are so expensive, but I guess they're worth it. Velik brushed that errant thought away and took another step in. His eyes scoured the branches overhead, looking for that small, many-limbed body. He didn't find it, but he did see patches of black ichor that helped him create a trail. It was enough to make a reasonable guess as to exactly how far the monster had circled around him. He reached the compass and had just an instant to see the arrow spinning crazily. It doubled back, he thought. Without even stopping to consider, he snapped his spear straight up, unleashing the stored-up energy in kinetic charge at the same time. There was a satisfying crunch, then something wet and heavy splattered onto his hair. Velik whipped the spear to the side, sending the body pinioned on the top sliding off to smack into a nearby tree. The spider, somehow, amazingly, still wasn't dead, but it was reeling. It got back upright, its movements jerky and unsteady, more black ichor dripping out a fresh hole. Velik didn't wait for it to make the next move, not when he saw a chance to end the battle. Before it could recover, he was on it, slashing and stabbing with his spear. Despite it all, the monster was a champion elite, and it was far more durable than its appearance indicated. The two danced around each other for several seconds, it trying to leap at him while shedding dozens of feet of razor-sharp silken web lines that whipped wildly between the trees. He kept it back with his spear, the superior reach giving him some measure of battlefield control even as the open area shrunk around them. Then the spider got through. It took a long, shallow gash across its back in the process of ducking under his spear, but an instant later, its fangs sank into the side of his leg. Velik's leather boots were no match for the champion's bite, and searing pain radiated out from the bites. Poisoned, the spear spun in Velik's hands like it was a living thing, and the butt end of it slammed down directly on the crown of the spider's head. It collapsed to the ground, only to twitch and try to rise again. A second strike put a crack in its outer shell, and a third snapped a chunk off. You have slain Ulkith the Shadow, Champion Elite, level 33. You have taken a champion seed from its former owner, Chalent. Champion seed's current reserves, 0/140. Chalent again. I knew it. What were you doing out here? With the immediate threat finally ended, the pain from his back injury came surging forward in full. Combined with the bite he'd suffered right at the end, Velik was almost certain the spider had realized it was going to die and had deliberately taken the blows just to guarantee it could inject a massive dose of venom into his leg. And he wasn't sure he was going to be hobbling back out of the grove, even with a healing potion. He drank one anyway, then groaned as partial relief swept through him. The burn in his leg didn't abate, but his back started to stitch itself together. While it worked its way through him, he limped over to reclaim his compass. It wasn't until he picked it up that he realized the truth. Son of a, he muttered. It was cracked down the center, and the arrow flopped around uselessly. I just got this thing. It was so expensive. The worst part of it was he wasn't even sure if it was him or the spider that had actually broken it. It had been working when they'd started the last exchange, but one of them had hit it hard enough to snap something inside the delicate device. Considering he barely knew how to use it in the first place, Velik doubted he had a chance of repairing it. Which means I'm stuck. Again, I need to replenish my potion supply. This champion fight proved that. Buying another compass on top of that means a month of hard work unless I can get this repaired. I doubt any of the locals can do it. Those two hunters probably don't have the expertise either, but maybe Torwin can point me towards someone who can or would be willing to buy it off me despite it being broken. Even a few thousand dekarmos for it would be better than nothing. While he waited for the healing potion to finish its work and the burning sting of the poison the champion had pumped into his leg to run its course, he went over his gains from the fight. The champion seed had the exact same format as the first one he'd obtained, only substituting Ulkith the Shadow were the other listed Balzarith the Living Inferno, and Velik had just as little idea what to do with this one. Of far more interest to him was Apex Hunter. When one skill got folded into another, it didn't always carry its full potential over with it. Stealth had imparted a strong understanding of how to balance his weight to move silently, or to put his feet to avoid brushing up against things, a sort of advanced proprioception of his whole body in relation to the world around him, and an understanding of sight lines, both in and out of the dark. Apex Hunter had some of that, but the proprioception tilted more towards combat now, and he was far, far more aware of not just what his prey could potentially see, but where they were likely to look. In exchange for the skill slot he'd freed up by folding stealth into Predator's visage, he'd lost a lot of the parts that concerned actually moving silently. It wasn't all gone, but it wasn't as strong as it had been before. Velik wasn't concerned about that. His old skill had included ambush tactics as part of its makeup, which overlapped with what he needed stealth for anyway. Besides, his physical stat was so high that even someone like Torwin had a hard time keeping track of him at night. As for his newly opened skill slot, Velik returned once again to his old weak points, range and area damage. The Black Fang, as a class, didn't seem to want to do range, and none of the class skills provided a good solution. There were general skills, of course, things like mastery or throwing mastery, but as a rule, Velik only took general skills when he had a plan to merge them into a class skill he already had. Weapon mastery skills for gear he didn't have, or used did not make the cut. Area damage was also something of a dead end, with the closest he could find being active skills that greatly increased his speed for brief windows. Those actually appealed to Velik quite a bit. Having what was essentially a free, reusable haste potion, even if the effect wasn't nearly as potent, could make future fights against opponents like the champion spider much easier. The problem was that if he locked that skill slot down with something like that, he wouldn't be able to gain new skills until he reached level 40, not unless he found a way to merge two of his existing skills together. It bore more consideration, but he had plenty of time to think about it while he traveled. His leg, meanwhile, wasn't getting any better. I shouldn't be surprised. It was a venomous spider bite from a champion elite. Even with my high physical, that's going to be a challenge. I could probably afford some sort of anti-venom from the system store, but if it's just a matter of riding out the pain, I'd rather save the money. He decided to give it another hour. If things didn't start feeling better by then, he'd have to spend another 1,000 or more dekarmos on a powerful antivenom. For the moment, all he could do was grit his teeth against the pain, pocket the broken compass, and start limping his way south toward home. The next morning after their late-night visitor, Jensen and Torwin left the dungeon. Whatever the broken orb was, Torwin seemed excited about it, and it was one more thing than Jensen had expected to find. It was beyond obvious that the dungeon was dead the moment they'd laid eyes on it, but he was just a lowly apprentice, so he'd kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. So, he really walked all the way out here to ask how to use a mana compass. Jensen asked as they walked. It's an honest enough mistake. That boy is entirely self-taught, from what I can tell. No instructors, no professors, no trainers. The spear isn't my weapon of choice, but I've never seen a fighting style like his. I think he just went out into the woods when he was a child, picked up a stick, and started beating on monsters. It's a miracle he's even still alive. Guess that unique class he's supposed to have was good for something, Jensen pointed out. He wasn't bitter or anything, but it was frustrating to think what he could have done with something like that, instead of a common tracker class. I think there's more to it than just the class, Torwin said. It was clear from the look on his face that he was a million miles away, lost in thought, but he still slipped through the undergrowth with an easy familiarity that Jensen couldn't hope to match. More than once, his master had started to drift ahead despite his seemingly casual pace, and Jensen had been forced to call him back. Like what? But Torwin just shook his head. It had something to do with that cracked orb, but Jensen didn't know what. Torwin refused to talk about it, too. He just kept saying he needed to take it back to the guild to have it properly appraised, thus the return back to the frontier towns. They'd already discussed the plan once they got there. Jensen would be sent out to run patrols near towns for levels and skill training, and Torwin would run back to Kravel, a trip he assured Jensen he could do in 3 days if he ran the whole way. Which is insane. How many points does the old man have in physical to move that fast? It's got to be over 100. Having Ranger as a class probably helps him with long-distance travel speed, but that can't be all there is to it. I wonder if he's got a skill for it, too. Most hunter-type classes favored speed and endurance in their physical stats, and Ranger was a rare one. Jensen had no doubt the class could do everything his own tracker was capable of and plenty more besides. But to cover what had to be better than 400 miles in 3 days was ridiculous. Or was it 300? How many days were we with that caravan before we peeled off? Jensen, pay attention, boy, Torwin hissed at him. He blinked and looked over at his master, who was glaring at him impatiently. What did I miss? A moment later, he realized he could hear something moving through the trees a few hundred feet ahead of them. The brush was too thick to get a good look at it, but they trained exhaustively with relying on other senses to pick up details they couldn't gain with their eyes. It's big, heavy, for legs? Or maybe more. Can't tell unless it starts running. Something crunched, probably a branch, but so loud that Jensen expected it was the width of a sapling. He held perfectly still and listened, not just to whatever was in front of them, but for any sign that it had friends. 2 minutes later, the creatures had meandered out of their way, and Jensen relaxed. What do you think it was? He asked his master. You tell me. Well, you didn't send me to hunt it, so it wasn't a monster. It was pretty big, judging by how much noise it made. Maybe a bear. You don't sound certain, Torwin remarked. Let me go look at the tracks it left, and I'll give you a better answer. The old ranger snorted. All right, fair enough. Come along then. Jensen's guess proved to be correct, though he was impressed at the sheer size of the paw prints. Each was the size of a dinner plate, and some quick approximations told him that the bear was probably better than 12 feet tall on 2 legs. He glanced at the trail it had ambled off down, now littered with broken twigs where its bulk hadn't quite fit through. You're sure that was an animal? He asked. I am, Torwin said. Didn't have the right smell for a monster. How the hell did you smell it from so far away? Jensen mentally boggled at the old man's nose. It's the mana, Torwin went on, seeing Jensen's expression. You'll eventually need a way to detect mana once you get to the higher levels, especially if you want to hunt monsters. Why waste a skill slot on it, though? Why not just get a mana compass like that other guy? They're not cheap, for one thing. For another, They could be lost or break. Besides, using one during a fight isn't a great idea, and sometimes you need to be able to sense your prey's mana. Jensen was skeptical of that first point. He opened his system store menu and almost immediately found a compass for 10,000 dekarmas. That's not bad, he thought as he bought one. It popped into existence in front of him, startling Torwin and earning him an incredulous glance. Why? The old man said simply. Jensen shrugged, wanted to see how they worked. I don't have room for a mana sense in my skill slots right now, but if they're that important, I should probably get familiar with them, right? I suppose, Torwin said, sounding almost reluctant. Come on, you stingy bastard. Give me some credit for showing initiative, if nothing else. Praise remained as elusive as always, but Jensen was used to it. After a few minutes of silence while he attuned the compass to himself, he asked, How does this thing work? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Torwin couldn't quite suppress a twinge of jealousy as he watched his apprentice fiddle around with a mana compass he'd apparently bought on a whim. He didn't even seem particularly interested in it, like it represented an idle curiosity to pass an hour's time before being promptly forgotten. He had to admit, though, Jensen seemed to have a better intuitive understanding of the device than Torwin had expected. After a brief explanation, no longer than the one he'd given to the Black Fang, his apprentice had already figured out a few things Torwin himself hadn't known. So, this must control the radius the compass detects out to, Jensen muttered as he adjusted the compass's controls again. The rune it was set to use shifted in shape, though Torwin couldn't tell what the different squiggles meant. It meant something to Jensen, and that was good enough. Right, and so that's a lower range, probably good for using as a monster ambush detector if you only care about things within 100 feet. If I take this back out the opposite way. Thought so. Once again, Torwin was struck by how wrong Ranger as a class seemed for the boy. Explorer would fit him so much better, or perhaps even something esoteric like Artificer. His family would never allow either of those, of course. Those were peasant classes, and Jensen's father demanded he evolve his current class into something that was at least rare grade. Perhaps there's something for him that could combine all those interests together. I think I'll do a bit of research while I'm at the guild. If I can present his family with a clear alternative path toward an acceptably respectable class, he might be able to convince his father to let him pursue it. How do you know what the runes mean? Torwin asked. Oh, I've seen them before on other devices back home. There's a whole armory full of stuff like this I used to get into when I was a kid. So, you've had a lot of time to experiment, then? You never had any tutors or anything? No, Jensen said. He glanced up from the compass he was playing with and asked why. I'm just impressed at your knowledge on the subject, Torwin told him honestly. If I'd known you were so proficient, I'd have asked you to explain the compass to our local friend. You would have given him a better lesson than I did. He'll figure it out. It's not that hard, Jensen said, apparently not realizing that Torwin himself had never figured out in 30 years with the Hunters Guild. Well, it was never a question that he was smart enough. It's just his lack of ambition and his allergy to getting up with the sun that are the problems. The pair walked in silence. Jensen, too, absorbed in figuring out the compass's many functions to properly pay attention to the world around him. Torwin wanted to chastise him, but just this once he bit his tongue. He was witnessing something unexpected, and he didn't want to interrupt Jensen. The monsters, of course, weren't so courteous. 5 minutes later, a pack of wargs picked up their scent, and Torwin was forced to shift his apprentice's attention to his next lesson. Velik grimaced at the number the system store gave him, but it had been hours since he'd been bitten, and it wasn't getting better. If anything, his leg felt a little bit worse. No matter how many times he told himself he'd give it just one more hour, nothing changed. He had no choice but to flush his stash of Dekarmas on the anti-venom now. He'd spent the last few hours looking at class skills with an eye for something offensive that would merge into Spear Warden, while he waited for his body to purge the poison, and even though he hadn't succeeded at restoring his good health, he had found 2 potential skills to choose from. The first was called Phalanx, and it wasn't really meant to be an offensive skill. It formed phantasmal spears to help defend against attacks from multiple angles, primarily by deflecting attacks and driving off enemies looking to close in a melee. It relied mostly on his mental stat to control the phantasmal spears, but the exact number he could create at a time was tied to Mystic. In the past, he would have avoided it simply because his whole build was optimized to stack physical and use skills that were primarily powered by it. Now, with his new hobby of hunting champion elites, he was starting to feel the need to expand his repertoire. Unfortunately, the skills he needed didn't synergize so well with his current stat balance, so he suspected he'd be allocating free points elsewhere for the foreseeable future. He was holding off on making a decision, primarily because while Phalanx seemed like something that he could modify to give him more offense, the other option he'd found scaled with physical instead. Savage Rhythm was a strange skill, suboptimal in that it took more time to ramp up to a point where it was viable than most of his fights lasted. It allowed him to slowly speed up his attacks, with each successive attack building off the previous. The other problem was that he had to continuously attack without relenting in order to maintain the skill. Against a single, powerful opponent, it was the better option, but he had concerns about finding a viable way to even train the skill up. His initial instinct was to lean into his strengths and add Savage Rhythm to his skill list. That strategy had worked well for him so far, and he was confident that he'd be able to merge the skill into Spear Warden within a few levels if he could find suitable targets to practice it on. With the mana compass broken, however, he wouldn't be getting any good use out of it in the near future. Savage Rhythm is better for what I'm trying to do right now, but Phalanx will be stronger in the end, especially if I can shift it more toward offense. It'll also benefit more from Spear Warden up front, and probably be easier to fold into another skill. Okay, I think I've made up my mind here. He added Phalanx as his newest skill, then navigated to the system store and spent 2,000 Dekarmos on an all-purpose anti-venom, leaving him with almost nothing left over. While he waited for the anti-venom to do its work, he activated Phalanx. It was a strange sensation, a floating, ghostly spear that he controlled with his mind. It felt clumsy, nothing like he was used to, but he was able to send it spinning out into a stuttering spin for a moment before it broke apart into wisps of light. With a bit of practice, he was able to set it to doing basic defensive weaves and jabs, nothing complex, but enough to hold an enemy off his flank. Then he added a second spear and a third. That was as far as he could stretch his piddling mystic stat, and for the time being, it was more than enough. Controlling one phantasmal spear while he fought was challenging. Making effective use of two was beyond his limits, and even keeping 3 active at once taxed him too much to actually do anything with them. But it's good to see how the skill will grow with practice. Maybe when I'm back home, I could try using it to kill some weaker monsters. He had the supplies to stick to the deep wood for a few more days, but with the mana compass broken, he didn't see much point. His only lead was out of his reach for the time being, and rather than forage for food all the way back, he decided to just leave early. If it wasn't possible to fix the compass, he'd come out with a month's worth of preserved rations and go on a murder spree until he could buy a new one. Maybe I'll get a level or 2 out of it. I know I'm close to 31, just not quite there yet. The sun rose before Velik left the grove, but with his new skills, he was confident he could still handle the higher-level monsters in the forest. It was a good test, either way, and it only took 10 minutes to run into the first one. With an eager grin, he summoned a phantasmal spear and got to work. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. You have advanced to level 4. +1 mental, +1 free point. Sildra let out a great sigh of relief as the last of the blade mantises died. Despite only being 6 inches long, their scythe-like arms were more than capable of leaving long slices or even cutting off fingers. Even though she didn't have to get up close to the monstrous bugs like Gorm, it was still scary fighting a set of sharp blades attached to wings. I got the level up, she called her bodyguard. We should head back to town before the moon goes down. Her first skill of her new class was called Lunar Flare, and it allowed her to harness moonlight and turn it against her enemies. The skill said it wasn't actually fire, but sure looked like it to her, albeit the same soft white as the moon. Regardless of how the magic worked, the monsters she hit with it were left with charred, ashy pale flesh. She quickly dropped her free point in a mystic, as she'd done every level. Exhaustion from using the skill was her primary weakness right now, with her limit being far too low for her liking. Half a dozen uses was all she could contribute to a single fight, and then only if she got at least an hour to recover between fights. The monsters weren't always so cooperative, though, so Gorm had come along, too. "I'm glad to hear it," Gorm said. His eyes scoured the battlefield, and with a deft hand, he quickly harvested a trio of mushrooms with pale blue frills under their caps. "I bet I can get at least 50 Hesplates for these." A few weeks ago, that would have seemed like a lot. Now, she was in possession of no less than 15 Dekarmas from all the late-night training sessions. It was a pittance when she looked at the price tags attached to the system shop, but in terms of everyday purchases using copper Hesplates or silver Vitrunes, it was a small fortune. She could even afford a handful of golden Fulmites, had there been a single one in any of the frontier towns. It almost made up for risking her life every single night. "Hey, so there is something I need to talk to you about," Gorm said about half an hour later as they neared the wall surrounding Deshur. My contract with your mom is up. Technically, it was up a few hours ago." "It is?" Sildra hadn't realized it had been 6 weeks already. She supposed she'd technically accomplished her goal, but it had been nice having the higher-level bodyguard with her while she trained and gained levels of her own. "Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you got that last level before I left town, you know?" "Oh, would you consider extending the contract? I've got some money now." Gorm sighed and shook his head. "Sorry, can't. I'm about to be out of here in the morning to get to my next job. I already accepted the contract before I left Cravel, and it's going to be hard enough getting back in time, as it is." "I see," she said softly. "Then, thank you. I couldn't have become a druid without your help." "It was my pleasure," he told her. "I've never seen anyone get a new class from a god before. Story to tell my grandkids someday. I wish I could stay longer and see you grow, but you have obligations to meet, and you wouldn't be a man of honor if you abandoned them," she finished for him. "I understand." "Right," he said lamely. "So, yeah, I'm heading out as soon as we get back. Hopefully I find someone with a wagon or a cart going the right way who doesn't mind me catching a ride while I sleep today." The two approached the gates, which were manned by a pair of night watchmen. Both had high enough mental to see in the dark, or perhaps some sort of skill. Either way, they recognized the duo and nodded to each other. "Good hunting, Sildra," one of them asked. "Level 4, she said with a smile. The other chuckled. "You'll be a right little powerhouse in no time at that rate. Here, let me get the gate open for you." Once they were inside, Gorm walked with Sildra until she reached her parents' shop. "This is goodbye," he said. "Do me a favor. If you ever see that Black Fang fellow again, tell him I said thanks for saving my life." "I will," she promised. "And thank you for everything, Gorm. I hope I see you again someday." Velik was 3 hours out from town and well away from the Deepwood when he finally got that level up he'd been waiting for. It came from killing a group of Wurgs that he'd specifically targeted as practice for phalanx. "You have slain a bristle fur Wurg, level 12. You have been awarded 1 Dekarma. You have advanced to level 31. +2 physical, +1 mental, +2 free points." For the first time in the last few years, he hesitated over where to slot those 2 free points. With his new skill, mental had suddenly become much more important, but he was confident that he could manage 3 of the ghostly spears with his current stats and a bit of practice. Increasing the skill's rank would help as well. What he wasn't sure of was whether he could ever form more than 3 spears at a time without increasing his mystic, or if they'd get more durable as the skill grew. Much to his annoyance, he'd found that the skill-crafted spears couldn't do more than distract high-level opponents. They just weren't strong enough to pierce the hides and scales of deepwood monsters, which was an unexpected problem. It didn't make phalanx worthless, but it did sharply limit its viability as an offensive skill if it couldn't actually hurt the monsters he needed to use it against. So, with some trepidation, Velik put the 2 free points in a mystic and reviewed his status. Name, Velik. Race, human dustbound. Class, the Black Fang. Level, 31. Physical, 99 +8. Mental, 54 +2. Mystical, 24. Free points, 0. Dekarma, 1247. Skills, Apex Hunter, rank 1. Spear Warden, rank 6. Kinetic Charge, rank 3. Phalanx, rank 1. Gear, Bloodseeker, +5 pH. Hunter's Cowl, plus 2 me. Stalker's Boots, plus 3 pH. Champion Seed, Balzarith. Champion Seed, Ultgith. He'd always regretted the points he'd put in a Mystic, but now they no longer felt wasted. If anything, he wished he'd put a few more into the stat over the last few months when a monster population had exploded and he'd started rapidly gaining levels. He was still hopeful that enough practice and a few ranks with a new skill would fix the issue, but some extra points in Mystic certainly wouldn't hurt. The sun was just peeking over the tops of the trees when Velik walked into the Raven's Nest. He'd spotted signs that Torwin and his apprentice had returned south a few days ago, and, lacking a better idea of where to find them, had decided to return to the inn where he'd last run into the man. If nothing else, he could probably leave a message that he wanted to talk with the innkeeper. Fortune was with him once again. Torwin was sitting at a table, shoveling his breakfast into his mouth and washing it down with a mug of some sort of beer. Next to him, Jensen was slumped over with his head on his arms and his eyes closed. He let out a soft groan when a shaft of sunlight passed across his face from the open door. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Black Fang himself," Torwin said. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon." "Things didn't go according to plan," Velik admitted. "Couldn't get the compass to work." "No." He fished out of his pocket and set it down on the table. "Broke it fighting a champion elite." "No, you didn't," Jensen said, raising his head to scowl at Velik. "Maybe running away from a champion elite. That I believe." Velik regarded him silently for a moment, then turned his attention back to Torwin. "I was hoping you knew a way to fix it." The old man laughed. "Me? No. I'm good at finding things and killing them. Jensen would have a better idea than me." Jensen leaned forward and scooped the compass up to examine it. A single look was all it took to have him shaking his head. "Well, outside my skill set, even if it was something you bought from an artificer instead of the system store, I still wouldn't be able to help. I guess a professional restoration would probably run you 2,000 to 3,000 dekarmos. That was still cheaper than buying a new one, but Velik had no idea where to even find someone with the ability to repair it. More importantly, he didn't have nearly that much money, nor did he want to waste however long it would take to travel to wherever he needed to go and wait for the work to be done. It would probably be faster to just resume killing monsters in the Deepwood, though it was fairly obvious that he needed to spend another week or so around the frontier's border thinning the monster populations back down before he went north again. Maybe I can salvage something from this, though. These two will go back to wherever they came from eventually. They could probably turn a profit on this thing once it's repaired, and I could use the dekarmos today. I don't have the time to get it repaired now," he said. "Would you be interested in buying it cheap? Once you get it repaired, it'd be a steal." "How cheap are we talking?" Torwin asked. "I paid 10,000 from the system store. If you bought it for 2 and it cost 3 to fix, you'd effectively be getting it at half off just for the hassle of taking it with you when you leave." "I already have one," Jensen said. He pulled a duplicate of Velik's damaged mana compass out and set it on the table. "Exact same one, actually. And I don't need one. I got a skill for it, though admittedly the range is rather limited compared to what the compass can do. If I'm ever doing a job where I do need one, I can just sign one out of the guild armory anyway." "Well," Velik said with an unhappy sigh, "I guess I wasted your time." "Sorry." "No, I wouldn't say it was wasted," Torwin said. "How about having a seat and getting a meal? I'd like to ask you a bit about what you found out there, if you don't mind. I have work to do. I'm sure it can wait 20 minutes. You gotta eat some time anyway." "I really don't." "Did you really break this thing fighting a champion on your own?" Jensen interrupted. "Why does it matter?" "Yes. And it wasn't in the dungeon? I mean, we were there, and besides, the dungeon's dead anyway. So, it was a wild champion elite." "I guess so. I've never even heard of a wild champion elite." "Those are supposed to take whole teams to kill," Jensen said. "Maybe Torwin could do it by himself, because he's a high level with a rare class, but for you to do it, well, there's an easy way to tell. If you killed it, you'd have the champion seed." "What's your point?" "Obviously, that champion seeds are valuable. If you have one, you could sell it. If it's a high enough level, it might be worth more than the compass itself. Do I need this thing? I've got 2 of them anyway, and besides, they were only important because they had Kalen's name on them. They don't even say that anymore, So they're not doing anything but sitting in a pouch now. But still, something about this. What are they used for? Velik asked. You mean, besides to grow a new champion? I doubt anyone wants to make more monsters. You'd be surprised, Torwin said dryly. But no, he means that champion seeds have other uses. Alchemists love them. Enchanters sometimes use them for their mana-holding properties. Certain classes can even consume them directly to gain permanent power increases, mostly along the druid lines. Velik's mind immediately went to Sildra. What would happen if she took one of these? He pushed that thought aside and said, I've got a level 35 and 33 seed. How much are those worth? Enough to trade for a mana compass, Jensen said eagerly. He started to push the compass across the table, but stopped when Torwin's hand came down on his arm. Let's not cheat the boy just because he doesn't know the value of what he's selling. Either of those seeds is worth 30 or 40,000 dekarmos to the right buyer, neither of which is us. However, I need to return to Cravel for a few days. I expect to be gone for about a week with travel time, and I would be willing to take one or both seeds with me, along with your broken compass. I'll sell them for you, get the compass fixed, and bring it back, provided you trust me to do so. It wasn't a difficult decision. As it currently stood, none of those things were useful to him. He could run down to the city himself, maybe even make it as fast as Torwin himself implied he'd travel. But when he got there, he wouldn't have the first clue who to talk to about fencing the seeds or repairing the compass. If Torwin cheated him, he would be at a huge amount of theoretical dekarmos, but wouldn't actually be any worse off in the real world. It would also be a good test of the two hunters' ethics. If Velik was going to be dealing with them while they were here, he'd prefer to know where they all stood with each other. Torwin seemed trustworthy, but there was no telling what was really going on in his head. Decision made. Velik pulled the two seeds out of the leather pouch that hung off his belt and set them on the table next to the broken compass. Then he gestured to the intact one and said, I'd like to borrow this while you're gone, if that's all right with you. A bit of collateral, huh? Torwin muttered. Fair enough. Jensen, who'd been staring slack-jawed at the two seeds, snapped his head around to look at his master. Being a bit free with things that aren't yours, aren't you? You weren't using it anyway, Torwin said unrepentantly. Besides, we both know it's barely pocket change for you. Pocket change? It was 10,000 dekarmos. There's no way a guy that we collected so much that it was bought on a whim. Jensen snorted. Fine, he can take it. But in return, I'm going to sleep in. The Hunters Guild spread throughout the north and west borders of Gastel, with headquarters in every major city on that side of the country. Monster attacks were a frontier problem, with few exceptions. And since killing monsters was the job, there wasn't much reason to keep a guild hall in the south where the nearest monster was 1,000 miles away. Cravel was still a bit farther from the action than Torwin liked, but the simple fact of the matter was that there wasn't a city closer to the borderlands here. So he sucked it up and ran the whole way. Hours and miles went by, and by the time the sun went back down, he was more than halfway there. Going back early hadn't been the plan, but he was eager to forge a working relationship with the local hunter. It wasn't often he met someone with a unique class, let alone one of the same type as his own. Torwin was hoping to convince the kid to sign up as a monster hunter once the crisis near his home was resolved. Even if the Black Fang refused, Torwin still wanted to help him. The kid was involved in all of this in a way even he didn't understand, and that made him the most likely path to resolving the monster infestation. Besides that, it was painfully obvious that he was entirely self-taught and had grown up in almost total isolation. The holes in his working knowledge were atrocious. Every time he recalled the expression on the Black Fang's face when he'd learned that alchemists could and did make potions at a fraction of the price the system store charged, Torwin laughed. Everything the local hunter used was purchased with dekarmos directly from the system itself, at prices so ruinous that even Jensen had boggled at the expenses. And it was all because the kid just didn't know anybody. Nobody in the frontier had classes with the skills to manufacture essential magical equipment. So the Black Fang had resorted to years and years of monster hunting to purchase a few pieces of gear himself. They'd had a discussion about how to spend all the dekarmos the Black Fang had coming his way, and if all went well, he'd be bringing back a whole host of supplies and gear, though the only thing that was absolutely essential was the repaired mana compass. If Torwin couldn't find someone to fix that, at least not in a short enough time frame, then the Black Fang was just going to buy a new one. Though Torwin hated not getting at least a few hours of sleep each night, he didn't stop running when the sun went down. By the time it rose again, he was only about 50 miles from Cravel. If he'd been fresh, he could have cleared the last leg in an hour or two, but after 26 hours of nonstop running, even he was starting to hit his limits. He passed through the gates 3 hours later, and as much as he wanted to turn into the nearest inn, drop a full mite or two on the counter, and dive face first into the nearest bed, he forced himself to keep moving. There was a tinkerer's shop a quarter mile past the north gate, and Torwin had yet to come across anything the old woman who owned it couldn't fix. He doubted this would be the broken trinket that ended a 2-decade-long, undefeated streak. "Belda? You still alive, you old bag?" he called out as he came through the shop's front door. "Who are you calling old? You mangy, leather-faced dog," a querulous voice yelled back. At 4.5 feet tall and maybe 70 pounds, Belda could have been mistaken for a child if not for her thin, gray hair and a face so covered in wrinkles that Torwin sometimes joked that the only reason she wore goggles was to keep her eyebrows from sagging over her vision. She looked frail enough that an errant breeze would knock her over, but she was an even higher level than Torwin, and those dainty fingers could dent steel if she squeezed. She emerged from behind a workbench, stopping only to scowl and hip-check the heavy wood where her tool belt got snagged on it. It skidded a few inches from the casual bump, and everything on its surface jumped in place before it stopped moving. Belda tottered past it and came to a stop in front of Torwin. "All done playing in the trees already?" she asked. "I thought you said you were expecting it to be at least a month, maybe 2. "Not done at all," Torwin said. "I left my apprentice up there to get some practice, but I had to come back down to the city to get some supplies. Things are strange. I've never seen anything quite like it. But here, take a look at this." He fished the broken compass out and handed it to Belda, who peered at it owlishly. "A mana compass?" she asked. She turned it over and snorted. "Someone step on it. It got dropped during a fight," Torwin explained. "My amplifier lens is cracked. That'll need to be replaced. Doesn't look like any of the runes are damaged, though. I'll need to open it up to make sure the collection array is still in one piece." Torwin nodded along like he knew what even half of the rambling meant. He'd long since found it was best to humor Belda and not ask distracting questions. She was more than happy to be pulled off on rambling tangents and easily offended by attempts to steer the conversation back to pertinent topics. So, instead of asking what she was talking about, he simply said, "I need to know how quickly it can be repaired and how much it'll cost. If the array is intact, 1,200 dekarmos in 3 days. 1,800 if you want to rush on it. If the array is damaged, 3,000 for same day, 25 by the end of the week." That actually isn't too far off what Jensen predicted. Too bad Belda won't take an apprentice. Manalite Artificer might actually be a good class for him. "I need it by tomorrow morning," Torwin said. "I'm only going to be in Cravel long enough to get a few hours of sleep and pick up supplies. You're too old to be hurrying like that. Don't come whining to me when you break a hip running around like you're still in your 20s. Please. The only way I'd break a hip is if I let you get your claws on it." Belda threw back her head and cackled. "And don't you forget it. All right, I'll get this thing opened up and start working on it. Whatever's wrong with it, I'll fix or replace. Pay up front. You wouldn't be trying to cheat me, would you?" Torwin asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "I seem to recall the last time I paid up front, it conveniently took every last karma to buy the parts. I gave you a discount, you ungrateful sack of mulch. Knocked 200 dekarmos off my labor fees to match the deposit. Belda, I have known you for way too long to fall for that. We both know you're so greedy you can make a dragon blush. You want it done or not?" The two glared at each other, but Torwin knew she had him. He needed this done immediately, and even with the rush fee, it was still far cheaper than buying a new one. Besides, it technically wasn't his money anyway. "Fine, you win." She cackled in the background while he started materializing stacks of 100 dekarma coins on her counter. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The seeds were sold through a guild intermediary, one who would undoubtedly get a better price for them than Torwin could negotiate himself. He had no idea what their actual value was, or who would be willing to pay that much for them. So it was a task better left to a professional. His last task before he found a bed and claimed it for at least 10 hours was to deliver the mysterious fractured orb that had supposedly granted the Black Fang his unique class to the guild archivist, a thin, pasty man named Andal. Andal rarely left the stacks, where he spent his time reading and cataloging information. Fascinating, he said after Torwin presented him with the two halves and explained what he'd learned. You're right, of course. For one thing, if this was a class orb, it's the biggest one I've ever seen. That's disregarding the fact that a class orb doesn't give two people classes at the same time, nor does it alter race, nor does it tend to break in half after it's been used. I know, Torwin said. So what is it then? I have an idea, but I'll need to look a few things up. That room you found at the top of the dungeon core is definitely a mana regulation chamber, though. It shouldn't have any connection to the class orb, if that's what we want to call it for now. Give me a few hours, and I think I'll have a few answers for you. That sounds perfect, Torwin told the archivist. I need to get some sleep. I've been running for over 300 miles nonstop to get this here as quickly as possible, but I'll check in after I wake up. Andal nodded, but he was already so distracted examining the broken orb that Torwin wasn't sure he was really listening. The archivist strode away, and several books flew off the shelves in his wake, chasing after him like paper birds with fluttering pages. Good enough for now. Time to find a bed. Things weren't as bad as Velik thought they'd be. There were plenty of monsters, but their levels hadn't improved much, and the town watch was still holding their own. Beldred had fended off a small invasion headed by a level 19 elite 3 days before Velik had returned, but they'd done it without a single casualty. Could have been a lot worse, but it's still going to take days to get back on top of this, he thought to himself as he roamed through the forest. He'd killed hundreds of monsters just in the last few hours, mostly through the efforts of phalanx. The skill was more awkward than he'd initially expected, but he was slowly improving his control. For the moment, the focus of his efforts was on increasing his accuracy. For these weaker monsters, it didn't make much difference if the tip of the magical spear struck an inch or two off from center mass. But he wanted to be able to hunt the deep wood, where pinpoint precision was a basic requirement. Normally, he didn't see many people out in the forest at night. Anybody without a high enough mental stat to see in the dark or some class-specific skill, or in Velik's case, a racial skill, was at too much of a disadvantage to the monsters that stalked the trees. Even lanterns and torches could only do so much to counteract the problem. So, Velik was used to running across the occasional woodsman in the afternoon and evening, then having the run of the forest to himself after the sun went down. That was why he was so surprised that he kept running into Sildra. Whatever her new class did, she also seemed to prefer working at night. Considering the ritual he'd overseen when a literal god had blessed her with a new class, he supposed that made sense. Less comforting, however, was the fact that she couldn't be any stronger than level 5 or 6, and maybe not that. It was rare to see a monster weaker than that, but ones at level 15 or higher were disturbingly common. Sildra was going to get herself killed if she wasn't careful, or maybe even if she was. Her bodyguard was nowhere to be found, and he knew firsthand how hard it was to survive in the woods solo. Back when he'd been her level, the monsters had been much weaker too. She wasn't a child, however, and he wasn't responsible for her choices. If all the strong monsters in the area she was hunting and happened to die, leaving her with only targets closer to her own level, well, that was just her good luck. He'd spoken with Jensen after he'd spotted her the first time, and the apprentice monster hunter had agreed to focus primarily on killing monsters over level 10, though he'd claimed it was just good sense to leave the weaklings to the locals who could safely dispose of them, while he focused his efforts where he could have the most impact. It'd be less suspicious if he'd agreed before he found out who we were trying to help. Velik might not have spent much time in civilization in the last decade, but he was still aware of how often young men made foolish decisions to impress pretty girls. Since it actually got Jensen to do what he wanted, he was willing to overlook that in this case. With any luck, the apprentice monster hunter's days would be too full from doing his job for things to go any further. unless Sildra decided she wanted it to. Whatever. That's not my problem. He spent 4 days in a cycle of sleep, hunt, eat, hunt, and sleep. The owner of the Raven's Nest didn't seem to mind him taking meals there, and Velik found that he quite enjoyed eating food that was properly cooked. The price was negligible, so he made it part of his routine to stop there early in the evening before the sun went down completely and the real work started. Unfortunately, while the Raven's Nest itself might tolerate his presence, other townsfolk were less understanding. There is a simple reason Velik had stayed away over the years. Dishur was the worst, but the other frontier towns held plenty of people who also blamed him for the rise in monster populations. Even those who'd previously been indifferent to his presence were starting to shift their stances over the last few months. It was enough to make Velik long to retreat back to the comfortable solitude of the forest, but since he was still waiting for Torwin to return with his repaired compass and the promised upgrades, he tolerated the state of things. He just finished some lamb's meat grilled on a stick and a thick slice of fresh, buttered bread for dinner when things came to a head. Less than 100 feet from the inn, a group of 6 loggers intercepted him. 3 circled around behind him to cut off his escape. Not that he thought for even a moment that they could stop him. Apex Predator was practically laughing in his head. "Listen here, Blacktooth, or whatever it is you call yourself," the one who appeared to be the leader said. It's Black Fang, boss," the one next to him said. "Shut it, Traver. I'm busy here." "Sorry, boss." Velik waited patiently, arms crossed as he watched. He itched to shape his spear into a combat form, but pulling it now would probably set the logging crew off, and he would be forced to hurt them. If he was lucky, this would just be verbal harassment and not an attempt at giving him a beating to get their point across. That had happened several times in the early years, even successfully once or twice. Someone had even chased him out into the forest and tried to murder him with a boar-hunting spear one night. That had been when Velik had sworn off ever setting foot in Dishur again, not in the least because he assumed the town would just hate him more when they discovered that guy's body the next day. Ahem. As I was saying, Blacktooth, we don't need you skulking around town, scaring honest, decent people and stealing things. Take your scrawny ass back into the trees and fall down a monster's gullet. Why don't you? "I was leaving town when you stopped me," Velik said. Well, good. And make sure you don't come back. We catch you here again, you won't live to regret it. I'm afraid I have business in this town. I'll be back tomorrow at the same time. Maybe you don't understand. I said leave and don't come back. The logger snarled, spit flying from his lips as he took an aggressive step forward and puffed out his chest. "I've got a physical of 42. You don't want to screw with me." That was probably an impressive amount for his level, but if that logger was higher than level 20, Velik would be surprised. When the man jabbed a finger into Velik's chest, he just stood there, unmoving. The logger poked him harder, then pressed his hand flat and shoved. Velik continued to stand there, unmoving. "I think you should know 3 things," he told the group. "First, my physical is over 100, so you'll forgive me if I'm not impressed. Second, I don't really like killing people. I prefer to spend my time hunting monsters. Third, I often find myself doing things I don't like." "The hell it is," the logger said, no longer making any pretense at subtlety. He put both hands on Velik and tried to shove him again. "It will be inconvenient to have to hurt all of you," Velik said. "This is the last time I'm going to ask you to walk away." Boss," Travers said from behind him. "Identify. Can't get a read on him. I think he's over level 25. The logging crew traded nervous looks with each other and backed up a step, leaving just their boss in Velik's face. Before he could decide whether to take a swing or run off, a hand reached out of nowhere and grabbed him by the back of his neck. "What's wrong with you, idiot? Don't pick fights with people twice your level," Torwin said. He jerked the logger backward and threw him to land on his back. The others scrambled to help their boss up, and wordlessly, they all retreated while giving the 2 hunters murderous looks. "That wasn't necessary," Velik said. "Figured it'd be better if you didn't have to kill anyone. Besides, I've got all sorts of stuff for you, and I've been carrying it around long enough. Let's head back inside, so I can pass it over and tell you what I learned." "Will it take long?" Velik asked. He wanted out of the town as quickly as possible and was more than happy to sort through everything out in the forest. "A bit," Torwin said. Some of the things I found out. Well, I got a few questions I'm hoping you can answer. It might help fill in a few holes and confirm what happened to you when you were a kid. What's there to fill in? It's obvious at this point that the monster I saw was Chalin. The class orb changes race, too. I guess there's only one way to find out. All right, Velik said. Let's find somewhere private to talk, though. I don't want everyone overhearing this. Induar's got a private parlor I'm sure he'll let us use, Torwin said. He walked past Velik and toward the Raven's Nest. Who's Induar? The parlor looked a lot like the common room, with an old, scuffed table in the center flanked by 6 chairs. A fieldstone fireplace dominated the back wall, and there was a faded painting of a young farming couple in front of a log house on the left wall. Whoever had done it wasn't terribly talented, and years of neglect had left the paint flaking off around the edges. First of all, here's this, Torwin said. He handed over a pouch similar to the one that already hung from Velik's belt. The primary difference was that the inside had been fitted with some sort of padded wooden framework, sized to slot up to 10 potion vials into. All of them were full. Healing potions at about 50 dekarma apiece. They're not as good as the system stores, but they're far more affordable. I can't believe I wasted so many thousands of dekarmas buying directly from the system over the years. I don't even want to try to figure out how many I've used. Thank you, Velik said woodenly as he accepted the pouch. Your compass, fully repaired, and with a field guide explaining how to use it, Torwin said, passing him a small wooden box. Inside was the promised compass and a folded over slip of paper. Velik skimmed it and saw it had directions for how to change settings, what each setting did, the maximum range, and warnings about various skills or natural phenomena that could block the compass from detecting things. That would have been useful a week ago, but better late than never. And with that, I'd like the return of my compass, Jensen said, holding out a hand. And I wouldn't say no to copying those instructions if you don't mind. No need for that, Torwin told him with a chuckle. He pulled out a duplicate sheet of paper and slid it down the table to his apprentice. I had the tinkerer make a second copy for you. It was good to have the compass back, and even better to finally know how to use it. He still didn't understand the symbols, but he could match the drawings to the compass itself. That was good enough. Probably the most exciting setting he hadn't realized existed was that the compass could extend its range in a specific direction by foregoing scanning everywhere else. That would allow him to focus his search to make sure he kept moving deeper into the wilderness as he hunted down the champions there. Now, as to the gear, here's some things that were sorely lacking from your kit, Torwin said. He set a pack on the table and opened it up. First, a shirt enchanted with mending and warmth. Obviously, you don't want to wear it during the summer days, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you how nice it'll be to have in a month or two when the weather turns. That was all well and good, but it was a light blue that really didn't blend in well with the shadows. Stealth might be gone, but it lived on in Apex Hunter, and the skill was telling him in no uncertain terms that he wouldn't be doing himself any favors if he wore it. Something to wear when I sleep, I guess. Weather-resistant cloak, Torwin said, passing over the next piece. Also enchanted with mending and sealed with oils to keep the rain off. Those aren't magical, and if the cloak gets too damaged, you'll need to reapply them. You know how to do that? I do, Velik said. He didn't have the supplies for it, but he could get them locally when he needed them. More importantly, the cloak was a dark, mottled green that would blend perfectly with the forest right up until the snow started falling. After the season turned, he'd need new clothes anyway. His old set had barely survived last winter, thanks mostly to a frostfang howler that had ambushed him right about the same time the snow started to melt. As far as the fun stuff goes, I got about 40,000 dekarmas for those 2 champion seeds. Most of that went into these 2 pieces. You said you wanted something that would boost your mystic stat up, and this is it. It was an earring, a white gold cuff that had been burnished to keep it from reflecting light. Torwin handed it to him and said, I recommend using something else to pierce the hole. If you try to use this, you'll probably break it. I will, Velik promised. What's the bonus on it? Plus 15, and that's all it's got. It won't resize or repair or clean itself. It's pure stats, and it's delicate. Watch you don't take any blows to the side of the head, or it might just break. That would certainly give him a sizable boost to the stat. More importantly, it would let Velik get a feel for exactly how useful Mystic was with his new skill, so he could decide if it was worth it to keep investing his free points into it. As long as the gains were enough to allow his phantasmal spears to pierce through the hides of deep-wood monsters, he'd consider it worth the time and effort. You said there was a second piece? Velik prompted. Yes. This is actually what I spent most of your money on. It wasn't something you asked for, but once I explain what I learned, I think you'll agree that you want it. Here, it's an amulet that increases your resistance to mental intrusions. Why would I need something like that? Velik asked flatly as he eyed up the amulet Torwin was holding out to him. It looked like an old coin, an inch across, and with a circle of the same kind of symbols the compass had. The coin sat inside a little steel wire mesh that was braided into the chain, itself also steel. He made no move to accept it. Correct me if I've made any mistakes in this sequence of events. When you were a child, you and your friend went into an old, destroyed dungeon and found a class orb. It granted you your unique class and changed your race and your friend. If I'm understanding things correctly, you thought your friend died, killed by a monster. He may have survived. The champion seeds were his before I killed the monsters that grew from them, Velik said. More likely, the class orb turned him into whatever that monster was, just like it turned me into a Duskbound. My thoughts exactly, except for one thing. I found the orb after you came to the dungeon the other week, and it's not a class orb. It's way too big. Class orbs don't change races, and they don't work on two people, then break. I took it with me and asked the guild archivist to look into it. If he's right, what you two found was actually a dungeon seed. Normally, the seed grows into a core, and when that core is destroyed, the seed is destroyed with it. My first thought was that the team who'd originally broken the dungeon had made some kind of mistake, but when I looked into things, that theory doesn't really fit. This thing looks like a dungeon seed, but it shouldn't exist, and even if it did, it shouldn't have done what it did to you two. It was from the dungeon core, Jensen said. You just told us that. No, you don't understand. You can't get a seed back out of core. That's like prying an acorn back out of fully grown oak. It just doesn't work that way. It looks like a dungeon seed, but it can't be from the dungeon. What are you saying? Velik asked. That someone came to the dungeon after it was destroyed and put a new seed in it. That's a theory. Dungeon seeds are incredibly rare, but apparently it's possible to revive a dungeon by planting a new seed in the broken core. It wouldn't be the same dungeon as before, but the new dungeon could cannibalize what's left of the old one to speed up its growth. That explains how the seed got there, except that, again, a dungeon seed cannot do what happened to you. Why not? Jensen asked. Other than that the guild doesn't have any evidence that it's happened before, what's stopping it? Torwin shook his head. I don't know. I'm just repeating what they told me. It looks like a dungeon seed, and we have a possible theory as to how it got there, but nothing should have happened when you picked it up. Everybody I described the situation to agreed that it should have been harmless to pick it up. Whatever caused your race to mutate into that subtype and granted you a class, it wasn't the dungeon seed. It has to be involved, right? I mean, this whole thing is too much of a coincidence otherwise, Jensen pointed out. No way something else transformed them at the same moment they find an abandoned dungeon seed inside an old, dead dungeon. I agree, which brings me back to the amulet. Torwin held it out again, and this time Velik hesitantly reached out to take it. While I don't think the dungeon seed is directly responsible for all of this, I do believe it influenced the change. New dungeons invariably have one thing in common. They have a core and they have a guardian. I think that your friend gained a class akin to the core and that you gained one to fulfill the role of its guardian. If I'm right, then it's entirely possible that the core, part of your bond, will be able to control you should you ever get close to it. Gear that makes it harder to take over your mind can only help in a situation like that. No. Velik wasn't sure he believed everything Torwin had just told him. There were a lot of guesses in there, and even if he accepted it all as fact, it raised even more questions. But if the veteran hunter had the right shape of things, then he'd made a good call with the amulet. Velik needed answers, and now he had the tools to find them. He slipped the chain over his head and tucked the old coin under his shirt. Thank you for sharing your theory with me, he said. I have work to do. Velik left the raven's nest 10 minutes later, having waited just long enough to receive close to 5,000 dekarmos that had been left over from the sale of the 2 champion seeds and to deflect some questions about his plans. Torwin had strongly hinted about forming a partnership, and if it had been just him, Velik might have considered. The old monster hunter had the levels and skills to keep up, but his apprentice didn't. He'd restocked his supplies for his next trip north while he was waiting for Torwin to return, and thanks to both his time spent practicing with Jensen's compass and the instructions Torwin's artificer friend had given them, Velik was confident he could track down what he was looking for. He wanted a few hours of sleep before he left, but then he planned on finally ending this decade-long ordeal. In a way, he was thankful that the monster population had exploded. If he'd been able to keep it under control forever, Velik probably would have spent his entire life going up and down a 100-mile stretch of wilderness frontier, killing monsters over and over again, and the mere thought of that exhausted him in a way he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't the fatigue of a hard day's work or of laying somewhere, wounded and waiting for the pain to stop. He couldn't quite describe why he recoiled from the idea. Already been on the job for 10 years, after all, but Velik very suddenly realized that he hated his life here. It was the hot meals, the conversations with a person who didn't look at him like he was scum, the answers the other hunters could just give him without any struggle to try to piece it together on his own. The actual monster killing part, he still enjoyed. Despite how he'd come by his class, he was grateful to have the Black Fang. But he was ready to do it somewhere else. Not until this is done, though. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I'm going to find you, Chalin. We're going to end this once and for all. The plan was simple. If Chalin was making champion seed somehow, then he had a class that was similar to a dungeon. The only difference was that instead of becoming tied to a single location and reclaiming those seeds, if a team of hunters happened to come in contact with him, he'd left them scattered about the wilderness for some reason. Velik had no answers for that behavior, but he also didn't much care what the reason was. If he could follow that trail, then eventually he'd find Chalin at the end of it. Once they met, one way or another, that would be the end of things. And then Velik would leave the frontier and maybe get to have something resembling a life. If he collected enough champion seeds, maybe he'd even end up rich enough to do whatever he wanted. Velik settled into his hollowed-out den and went to sleep for what he hoped was the last time ever. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Jensen watched the local kid walk out of the inn and rolled his eyes. Melodramatic, isn't he? He's young, but truthfully, he's gone through a lot. He was essentially exiled from his home after his own actions caused monsters to attack it and orphan him. That's a tough way to live as an adult, let alone when you're 7. It's obvious he's completely lacking any sort of education or training. Everything he does, he's making up as he goes along. Despite that, he's managed to thrive as a hunter. Torwin lapsed into silence and stared at the door. Whatever else was on his mind, he apparently wasn't in the mood to share. Jensen hoped he wasn't thinking about trying to pick the kid up as another apprentice. That would violate the terms of the contract between the Hunters Guild and the Alderworth family. He kind of got the impression that his master wasn't thrilled about having Jensen as an apprentice anyway, though he wasn't sure if that was because he didn't like Jensen in particular or if he just didn't want any apprentice. For as much as his father was paying to have the best the guild had to help him gain a rare or better class evolution, Jensen didn't see what Torwin had to complain about. Completing this contract would set someone like him up for life. This whole job was supposed to be a way for Jensen to practice some skills and pack on a few levels, but Torwin was more interested in Velik just because of his unique class. If he'd just taken the job seriously, they'd have cleaned out every monster within 50 miles of the towns by now. Instead, he was inventing some sort of mystery to keep in contact with Velik. It was obvious that the dungeon seed the guy had found when he was a kid had screwed his life up, but there was no way his buddy was out there, walking around like some sort of living dungeon, shitting out monsters every 5 steps. The guy had probably died a decade ago. They could go find the source of the monsters, maybe Velik's childhood friend's grave, and take care of it. But that wasn't the contract they were out here for. "Let me ask you a question," Jensen said. "What's that? What should I be doing to evolve Tracker into Ranger?" Torwin let out a heavy sigh. "Jensen, you're a smart man. I understand that you have constraints on your future, but in my opinion, you will never achieve a class evolution into Ranger. There are other classes that would suit your personality far better. Wait, are you just giving up on me? He demanded. We have a contract. Your father and the guild have a contract. And if you want someone else to help you, I won't take offense. But I don't think I can get you to where you want to be. I was going to put this conversation off until we were done here, but I'd like you to consider an alternative. The contract is for Ranger. My father won't accept alternatives. It had been hard enough to get him to accept Ranger for Jensen. He'd wanted some sort of noble profession, something like merchant lord, that would allow Jensen to oversee the Alderworth financial holdings while his older brother ruled the family. It was only when his sister, the middle child of the three, had developed her own class that father had finally agreed to let Jensen keep his original class of tracker, and only under the condition that he grow it into something of at least rare quality. Then I'm sorry to say that your father is bound to be disappointed, Torwin said, turning his attention fully to Jensen. I can't make you act like a Ranger, Jensen, and I'm sorry to say that you don't have the right motivation to be one. You don't care about these people. Why would I? They're strangers. We came here to do a job, and that was to kill the monsters around the village. So, if you were in charge, you'd say we should go out, wipe out everything within so many miles of the border, collect our fee, and leave. That is exactly what we were hired to do, and that's why you won't ever evolve your class into Ranger. A Ranger has to care about people, to be a hero to those in need. You're not a hero. You're a mercenary, an honorable one, maybe, but a mercenary nonetheless. The sooner you square yourself up with that truth, the sooner we can start looking into an alternative class that actually fits you. Or you can keep on trying, but you're never going to succeed. But Jensen sat there, unable to think of what to say. He had to become a Ranger. It was the only class his father would let him keep that was remotely close to what he wanted to be. If he failed, he'd end up shackled to an office somewhere on the family estate or banished to an outpost steward by one of his many cousins. I'm sorry, son. I truly am. You're caught in a hard place, torn between the class that's right for you and your family's demands. Why don't you take some time to think things over? I'm going to follow our new friend out into the deep wilds and put an end to this monster incursion. All I'm asking you to do is keep a lid on the monsters showing up around here for the next week or two. Train your skills. Gain some levels. When I get back, we'll have a real discussion about your future. Don't lose hope, Torwin told him as he stood up from the table. I might not be able to guide you to Ranger, but if your father's primary requirement is the prestige of a rare class, well, I have something else in mind that he might like even better. You don't know him, Jensen said numbly. Once he's made up his mind, it's impossible to change it. Oh, even if I could offer an epic rarity class instead. Torwin teased. Epic? Something that he thinks would fit me? What? What is it? His master winked at him and said, For now, you just focus on keeping these villages safe. Once we've finished up this job, we'll talk more. We've got some people I'll need to get on board, including your father, before we start the process. Torwin swept out of the common room, leaving Jensen sitting there by himself, his mind awhirl with confusing and contradictory thoughts. The giant lizard's body slammed into the ground with a hard, meaty thump. Black blood trickled out of its mouth and stained its teeth. Velik stood 10 feet away, staring at it impassively as 4 spears made of magical energy kept the monster pinned through its death throes. You have slain an elite Iron Jaw Croc, level 34. You have been awarded 3 to Karma. You have advanced to level 32, plus 2 physical, plus 1 mental, plus 2 free points. Phalanx has advanced to rank 2. The reptile was over 20 feet long, not including the tail, and had a mouth big enough to bite through Velik's chest. It had lunged at him out of the stream when he was refilling his water skin, an unexpected ambush that had broken the illusion of safety he'd been carrying. No matter how high my stats go and how many ranks I stack up, there's always going to be something that can sneak up on me if I don't pay attention. The monster had pushed him up to the next level, however, and it had provided good practice for Phalanx. Velik had spent most of the fight dodging its snapping jaws, sometimes by literally standing on a monster when it lunged at him, and let the phantasmal spears do their work. They couldn't penetrate the leathery flesh of the monster. Not easily, but that was the point. The challenge was to find weak spots in its body and strike with pinpoint accuracy, and Velik was pleased to see that he'd risen to the occasion. After fighting 3 champion elites this week, he no longer considered normal elites difficult. Even when they were higher level than him, they lacked the complications champion arenas added to the battles. Sometimes, an elite surprised him with an interesting or unique ability, but those were still easily handled. The compass led him deeper into the wilderness than he'd ever gone, though not necessarily in a straight line. Over the past week, he'd probably run 500 miles of forest, but he doubted he was more than 300 away from the nearest town. For all of that, he'd gathered a wealth of power in Dekarmas. If the 3 champion seeds he'd collected were worth as much as Torwin had gotten for the first 2, he could probably afford a real upgrade from the system store. Maybe even something epic like his spear. With the croc thoroughly dead, Velik hopped over the body and scanned the stream. For water so clear, it was surprising that anything could hide in it, but the monster had nestled into the bottom near the bank and covered itself in a layer of silt. It had to have some kind of skill to move that fast when it had lunged at him, but it hadn't been enough to actually catch Velik. Wary of a second croc coming to finish the job, he quickly finished refilling his water skin and followed the compass deeper into the forest. Using the notes Torwin had furnished him with, he narrowed down the search criteria to only point towards monsters with enough mana over a certain threshold, one which he'd refined over the last few days through trial and error to point to champions. Velik ran for another 6 hours, trying to find a next champion and hoping it would be the one at the end of the line. When the sky started to lighten and he still hadn't found it, he slowed his pace and prepared to find a good spot to catch a few hours' sleep. Against a normal monster, or even an elite, he wouldn't hesitate to fight during the day. But for a champion, he wanted to be at peak strength. He'd been scouting out the area, clearing it of weak monsters, and looking for a defensible den when some niggling sensation filled his mind. Something is wrong, maybe? Or not wrong, but he couldn't quite place the feeling. There was nothing there, nothing he could see, hear, or smell at least, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was wrong. Something was hiding nearby, watching him, stalking him. He needed to find them before they attacked. Apex Hunter has advanced to rank 2. Velik's eyes widened. Normally, he'd celebrate a skill advancement, but in the moment, all it told him was that he was right to be worried. He still couldn't find whatever it was that was lurking nearby, something dangerous and sneaky. No, that's not right. It doesn't feel. Ugh, what is this? It is dangerous, but not to me? What is this skill trying to tell me? He didn't know what it was that caught his attention when he walked past that tree. There was no flicker of movement, no slight creaking of wood or rustle of leaves. As far as his eyes and ears were telling him, there was nothing there. Apex Hunter disagreed, and before Velik was even aware of what he was doing, his spear had snapped out to its full length, and he was slicing it through the branches. Something smacked the shaft and deflected it so that the head bit deep into the bowl. Velik pulled it free and danced back, just in case whatever was lurking in that tree had limbs longer than his spear. Easy there, a voice called out, one Velik recognized. Torwin dropped free of the branches and pushed his way free of the tree. He was shaking one hand as if in pain and eyeing Velik's spear up, but was otherwise unharmed. What are you doing here? Velik asked coldly. Chasing after you, obviously. You're devilishly tricky to hunt down, you know that? Running this way and that. I tried calibrating Jensen's mana compass to match what you were looking for, but I couldn't quite figure it out. Easier to follow the trail of bodies, but you move so damn quick, I started falling behind. If I wanted your company, I would have told you so a week ago. The old man sighed and regarded Velik. You understand why I'm here, don't you? Here in the frontier, or here, following me? I'm going to assume you don't get it, because otherwise you wouldn't be trying to draw a distinction. I took this contract so that my apprentice could develop his skills. It's honestly way beneath what hunters of my rank typically deal with, or at least it should be. I was expecting to hunt down a few hundred monsters at or below level 20. But then once I got here, I realized this has been an ongoing issue for years. Torwin jabbed a finger at Velik. You've been keeping it contained, and apparently doing such a thorough job that those ungrateful assholes in D-Shire never even realized it was still a problem until the population exploded. They said it happened 2 months ago, but I'm guessing it was a lot longer. 2 months was just when it started to be more than you could take care of by yourself. What's your point? Velik asked. Just killing the monsters near the border won't accomplish anything. Give it a few weeks, maybe a month, and new monsters will be there. Maybe the level won't be as high, but they'll be just as numerous. And if the population explosion doesn't stop, then next time, it'll be a whole team of hunters up here trying to keep things under control. The real job is to find the underlying cause and fix it. And you think I'll lead you there? Exactly, Torwin said. I'm not trying to step on your toes. I'm not trying to steal your kills. I don't want anything from you. I just want to find out what's causing the monster population to boom, whether that's your friend or something else, and stop it. Right now, I think you're heading the right direction. If I learn something else that changes my mind, I'll chase after that. While the Dekarmos will be nice from a whole crop of champion seeds, the truth was that Velik didn't actually know who to sell them to. The system store didn't buy things, and, as he'd just learned, the things it sold were grossly overpriced. Maybe the gear was worth it, but those healing potions cost 10 times more than they should. That hadn't stopped him from buying another emergency haste potion, however, just in case. Where's Jensen? Velik could accept that Torwin could get close, but there was no way his apprentice had snuck up on him. Torwin shook his head. He doesn't have the stats or the skills to survive this far into the wildlands. I left him back in town with instructions to keep the pressure off the locals. He mentioned something about a druid he'd worked with one day while I was gone, so I think he's coordinating with someone else who came to help. She's local, Velik said. Morgus blessed her with a new class a few weeks back. Torwin's jaw dropped open. Morgus blessed her? I think I'd like to meet this woman. I'm not going to stop you. Just don't expect an escort back. No, we have more important matters to attend to. But when our business is concluded, yes, I'd like to meet one blessed with a new class by my god. Velik wasn't eager for company, but he'd rather know where Torwin was than have Apex Hunter itching in the back of his mind all the time. I was looking for a place to get a few hours of sleep. Join if you want. Torwin chuckled and jerked his head to the side. Over that way. Spotted it an hour ago when I was looking for you. There's a nice grove over that ridge, tight tree placement on one side, and a solid embankment on the other. Maybe this won't be so bad, Velik thought to himself. It was different, but that didn't mean worse. Torwin started chattering about tree seeding patterns and how to use it to map unfamiliar forests while he led the way. Or maybe it will.